Hey guys, tonight, the red clay of Georgia. The Georgia sun did not just shine in the 1930s. It weighed upon the shoulders of the men and women of Atlanta like a physical burden. It was a heat that brought out the sharp, metallic scent of the red clay, that iron-rich earth that clung to boots, stained the hems of Sunday dresses, and served as the silent foundation of a segregated empire. For young Michael King Jr., born on a cold January day in 1929, this clay was his first playground and his first teacher. It was the stage upon which the opening act of an American Revolution would be performed. The fortress on Auburn Avenue. To understand the man who would one day stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, one must first walk down Auburn Avenue. In the 1930s, this stretch of pavement was famously known as Sweet Auburn, the richest Negro street in the world. It was a self-contained kingdom. Because the white world downtown offered only whites-only lunch counters and back alley entrances, the black community built their own world here. Young Michael lived at 501 Auburn Avenue, a two-story Victorian house with a spacious porch that served as the neighborhood's observation deck. The King household was not one of struggle in the traditional sense. They were the black elite. But this status came with a heavy price, the responsibility of leadership. The house was filled with the smell of slow-stewed collard greens, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, and the constant, low hum of theological debate. His father, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., was a man built of granite and conviction. He had escaped the sharecropping fields of Stockbridge, Georgia, where he had seen his mother beaten and his family cheated. He had walked to Atlanta with nothing but a dream of dignity. By the time Michael was a toddler, Daddy King was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, a man who refused to be called boy and who led the local NAACP. Michael watched his father with wide, observant eyes. He saw how his father carried himself, with a chest puffed out not from arrogance, but from a refusal to be crushed. He watched his father drive his Ford into a gas station and drive right back out when the attendant refused to serve him with respect. This was Michael's first lesson. Dignity is a choice before it is a right. The mother of the movement, Alberta King. While Daddy King was the thunder, Michael's mother, Alberta Williams King, was the steady rain. A woman of immense grace and education, she was the daughter of the legendary A.D. Williams. If the King men provided the fire, Alberta provided the light. She taught Michael how to read before he entered school, but more importantly, she taught him how to think. In the quiet moments on the porch, as the fireflies began to dance over the red clay, she would explain the confusing world to her son. She had to perform the most heartbreaking ritual of black motherhood in America, the talk. She sat him down and told him about the history of slavery, how their ancestors had been brought in chains, how the Civil War had supposedly freed them, and how the system, Jim Crow, was a new kind of cage. But she ended every lesson with a mantra that Michael would carry into every jail cell and every pulpit. You are as good as anyone. Don't you ever forget that. This duality, the father's external resistance and the mother's internal affirmation, created a psychological fortress for young Michael. It shielded him from the corrosion of the soul that segregation usually inflicted on black children. The shattering of the playground. Despite the protection of Auburn Avenue, the red clay eventually revealed its jagged edges. The most formative trauma of Michael's childhood involved a white friend, the son of a neighborhood grocer. For years, the two boys played in the dirt, oblivious to the invisible lines drawn by the Georgia legislature. They shared toys, chased balls, and tumbled through the grass. But when they reached the age of 6, something changed. They were sent to different schools, Michael to the black school, his friend to the white one. One afternoon, Michael knocked on his friend's door, and the boy's father stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold indifference. Michael ran home, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't understand. He felt the sting of a rejection he hadn't earned. He asked his parents why some people hated him without even knowing him. That night, his father didn't just comfort him, he challenged him. He told him that he must not hate back. He told him that hate was a burden too heavy to bear. This was the moment the moral compass began to spin. Michael realized that the world was broken and that the red clay was soaked in an ancient poison. He began to look at the whites' only signs not as laws of nature, but as insults to God. The pulpit and the social gospel. The epicenter of Michael's life was Ebenezer Baptist Church. To a young boy, the church was a theater of the soul. He watched the deacons in their starched white shirts, the choir in their flowing robes, and the Amen corner, where the elderly women would shout encouragement to the preacher. The black church in the South was the only place where a black man could be a king for an hour. In the white world, they were janitors, maids, and laborers, but at Ebenezer, they were chairmen, trustees, and children of God. Michael was fascinated by the social gospel. His father didn't just preach about the streets of gold in heaven, he preached about the lack of paved streets in black neighborhoods on earth. He used the pulpit to organize voter registration. He used the offering plate to help families who had been evicted. Young Michael was a precocious child, a term his teachers used often. He had a gift for words that bordered on the supernatural. By the age of 5, he was reciting hymns and poems, but he was also a skeptic. He struggled with the emotionalism of the church. He wanted to know why. He questioned the stories of Jonah and the whale. He wanted a religion that satisfied his mind as much as it moved his feet. This intellectual hunger led him to Morehouse College at the tender age of 15. Morehouse was the North Star for black intellectuals. There, under the mentorship of Dr. Benjamin Mays, Michael's red clay upbringing was refined into a philosophical weapon. Mays told him that the church must be a force for social change, that a relevant religion was one that concerned itself with the slum as much as the soul. The bus ride from Dublin. The final hardening of his moral compass occurred during his high school years. Michael had entered an oratorical contest in Dublin, Georgia. His speech was titled "The Negro and the Constitution." Even then, his voice had that rich, baritone resonance that would one day command millions. He won the prize. On the bus ride back to Atlanta, flushed with the victory of his words, the bus filled up with white passengers. The driver, a man white with rage, ordered Michael and his teacher to give up their seats. They were forced to stand in the aisle for 90 miles as the bus bounced over the uneven Georgia roads. Michael later described that night as the angriest he had ever been in his life. The red clay felt like a prison, but instead of letting that anger turn into a blind rage that would destroy him, he channeled it into a vow. He realized that words, the very words that won him the prize in Dublin, were the only thing powerful enough to break the system. The Michael and the Martins. By the time he left Atlanta for seminary, Michael King Jr. had become Martin Luther King Jr. The name change was his father's doing, a tribute to the great German reformer, but it fit the young man's destiny. He was a product of the red clay, stubborn, enduring, and rooted in the earth. But he was also a product of the black church, visionary, prophetic, and soaring. He carried with him the sweet Auburn confidence, the Ebenezer faith, and the Dublin anger. The boy from 501 Auburn Avenue was no longer just Michael. He was the midnight prophet in the making. He knew that the road ahead would be paved with the same red clay, but he was no longer afraid of the stains. He knew that to change the world, one had to be willing to get their hands dirty in the struggle for justice. The Crucible of Crozet. The train ride from Atlanta to Chester, Pennsylvania, in 1948 was more than a change of geography. For 19-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., it was a journey through the looking glass. As the locomotive hummed north of the Mason-Dixon line, the rigid, visible barriers of the South, the colored and white signs that had dictated his childhood, began to vanish. But as the red clay of Georgia faded into the gray, industrial soot of the North, Martin felt a different kind of chill. He was entering Crozet Theological Seminary, a predominantly white institution where he would no longer be a prince of sweet Auburn, but a minority of one. The architecture of the North. Chester, Pennsylvania, was an industrial town defined by the grind of steel and the smoke of refineries. It was a landscape of red brick and cold Atlantic winds. To Martin, the North initially felt like a breath of freedom, but he soon realized that the promised land had its own shadows. In the North, racism was not a sign on a door, it was a ghost in the room. It was the way a white woman clutched her purse tighter in an elevator, or the way a professor's eyes lingered a second too long on his work, searching for a flaw. Martin checked into his dormitory with a meticulousness that bordered on the obsessive. He knew the burden he carried. He was not just there to study, he was a representative of his race. He became the most polite man on campus. His clothes were always pressed, crisp white shirts, dark suits, and ties knotted with mathematical precision. He was never a minute late to a lecture. He was engaged in a silent war against the lazy and unrefined stereotypes that white America projected onto black men. This was the social mask, a psychological armor he wore until he felt his intellectual footing was secure enough to let it drop. The intellectual furnace, discovering the word. At Crozer, Martin's mind became a sponge for the most complex ideas of Western civilization. He didn't just read books, he interrogated them. He sat in the library for 12 hours at a stretch, the smell of old parchment and floor wax becoming his new oxygen. He began with the Greek philosophers, finding in Plato and Aristotle the roots of logic and justice. But it was when he reached the modern era that the crucible began to glow. He delved into Hegel's dialectics, fascinated by the idea that progress comes through struggle, the thesis clashing with the antithesis to create a synthesis. He saw the American racial struggle in these terms: the thesis of white supremacy and the antithesis of black resistance would eventually have to merge into a new, higher form of American democracy. However, he was still searching for a method. He knew the world was broken, and he knew the church had a duty to fix it, but he didn't know how. The turn the other cheek philosophy of his childhood Sunday school felt insufficient against the brutal reality of the Ku Klux Klan. He was looking for a tough-minded Christianity. The ghost of the Mahatma. The turning point of his life occurred on a Sunday afternoon when he traveled to Philadelphia to hear a lecture by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, the president of Howard University. Johnson had just returned from India, and he spoke with a fire that Martin had only previously heard in the Ebenezer pulpit. He spoke of a small, frail man named Mohandas Gandhi. Martin was electrified. He went out and bought every book he could find on Gandhi's life. He studied the concept of satyagraha, which translates to truth force or love force. For Martin, this was the missing piece of the puzzle. Gandhi had taken the passive ethics of Jesus and transformed them into a powerful, nonviolent political weapon. Gandhi showed that nonviolence was not doing nothing, it was a form of nonviolent coercion. It was about using the power of suffering to touch the conscience of the oppressor. I came to see for the first time, Martin later wrote, that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, is one of the most potent weapons available to an oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. The red clay boy had found his sword, a sword that didn't kill, but healed. Nibua and the natures of evil. But Martin's intellectual journey was not a simple upward trajectory toward peace. He encountered the works of Reinhold Niebuhr, a theologian who threw a bucket of cold water on Martin's growing optimism. Niebuhr was a Christian realist. He argued that humans are inherently sinful and that groups are more immoral than individuals. Niebuhr warned that a sentimental love would never work against entrenched power. He believed that the oppressor never gives up their privilege voluntarily, they must be forced to do so. This created an agonizing tension in Martin's soul. He spent nights packing the halls of Crozer, debating with himself. If Niebuhr was right, then Gandhi's love might be a fantasy. If Gandhi was right, then Niebuhr was too cynical. Eventually, the crucible of Crozer produced a synthesis. Martin concluded that he must combine the tough-mindedness of Niebuhr with the tender-heartedness of Gandhi. He realized that nonviolence must be aggressive, organized, and strategically designed to disrupt the status quo. He understood that you could love your enemy while simultaneously making it impossible for your enemy to continue their injustice, the pistol and the proof. The theories were soon put to a physical test. In 1950, a white student from North Carolina, perhaps threatened by Martin's academic brilliance and popularity, burst into his room and pulled a pistol. The air in the small dorm room turned electric with the scent of gun oil and fear. The campus froze, but Martin did not. He didn't dive for cover, nor did he lung for the weapon. He stood still, his voice dropping into that calm, resonant baritone that would one day soothe a rioting nation. He spoke to the student not as an enemy, but as a troubled brother. He talked the man down with a quiet authority that shocked the onlookers. When the school's administration wanted to expel the student and call the police, Martin did the unthinkable. He refused to press charges. He invited the student to dinner. This wasn't a performance, it was a laboratory experiment. He wanted to see if the love force worked. It did. The student eventually apologized, and a potential tragedy was turned into a testament to the power of nonviolent resistance. The refining of the prophet's voice. Beyond the books, Crozer was where Martin refined the oratory of the movement. He began to study the great white preachers of the North, but he realized they lacked the soul of the Black South. He began to experiment with a new style, a synthesized eloquence. He would start a sermon with a cold, logical analysis of a Greek word or a Hegelian concept, catering to the intellectual mind, and then slowly transition into the rhythmic, call-and-response cadences of the Georgia pews. He was learning to speak to two different Americas at once. He was building a bridge between the university and the street, between the PhD and the domestic worker. He was becoming a man who could discuss the critique of pure reason in the morning and lead a prayer meeting in the evening. The Call of the South. By 1951, Martin graduated from Crozer at the top of his class. He was the valedictorian, the plumb line, the model student. He moved on to Boston University to complete his doctorate, where he would meet Coretta Scott and further refine his philosophy of personalism, the idea that God is a personal being who cares about every individual's struggle. He had several offers to stay in the North. He could have been a prestigious professor at a northern university, living a life of comfort and safety. He could have preached at wealthy northern churches where his life would never be in danger. But the crucible had done its work. The fire of Crozer had burned away the Michael King Jr., who was merely a son of a preacher. In his place stood Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man who realized that his new weapons, Gandhi's nonviolence and Niebuhr's realism, were useless in the safety of the North. He looked back toward the South, toward the Montgomerys and Birminghams, toward the red clay that was still stained with injustice. He knew that the only way to prove his philosophy was to live it. He packed his books, his starched shirts, and his love force, and prepared to return to the heart of the storm. Montgomery's Midnight Call. The air in Montgomery, Alabama, in the winter of 1955 was brittle and charged with a tension that felt like an approaching electrical storm. To the white establishment, Montgomery was the cradle of the Confederacy, a city where time had seemingly frozen in a tableau of white pillars and subservient shadows. But to the 50,000 black citizens of the city, Montgomery was a daily gauntlet of humiliation. This was the world that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a 26-year-old intellectual with a fresh doctorate from Boston University, had entered to lead the dignified Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He had come to be a pastor. He did not know he was about to become a target. The geography of disgrace. The Montgomery bus system was the primary site of the city's racial theater. It was a bizarre and cruel machine. Black riders, who comprised nearly 3/4 of the bus company's revenue, were required to pay at the front, exit the bus, and re-enter through the rear door. If the white section filled up, a bus driver, often acting with the unchecked authority of a plantation overseer, could order an entire row of black passengers to stand so a single white person could sit. On December 1, 1955, the machine broke. Rosa Parks, a quiet seamstress with a fortress of dignity behind her eyes, refused to move. Her arrest was not a fluke. It was the final straw in a century of broken backs. When the news reached the local leadership, a boycott was proposed. They needed a leader, someone who had the education to speak to the white power structure and the soul to speak to the masses. They chose the new man, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin was hesitant. He had a young wife, Coretta, and a newborn daughter, Yolanda. He knew that in Alabama, leadership didn't come with a trophy, it came with a cross. But fueled by the social gospel, he had mastered at Crozer, he accepted. He was no longer just a preacher, he was the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA. The night of 5,000 candles. On December 5, 1955, Martin faced his first great test, the mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church. Thousands of people spilled out into the streets, listening through loudspeakers. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and wood smoke. Martin had only 20 minutes to prepare. He didn't use the academic citations of his dissertation. He reached back into the red clay of his Georgia roots. His voice, a rich baritone that seemed to vibrate the very pews, filled the hall. "There comes a time," he thundered, "that people get tired. We are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression." The crowd roared. It was a sound Martin had never heard before, the sound of a people waking up. But as he left the church that night, the weight of their expectations settled on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He realized that he wasn't just leading a protest, he was responsible for the lives of every person in that room. The Midnight Kitchen, the turning point. By January 1956, the honeymoon of the boycott had vanished. The city had struck back with get tough policies. Martin was arrested for traveling 30 mph in a 25 mph zone. His phone became a fountain of filth, death threats, racial slurs, and descriptions of how he would be killed. On the night of January 27, Martin sat alone in his kitchen at 501 Dexter Avenue. The house was deathly quiet. A fresh death threat had just come over the wire, and this one felt different. It felt inevitable. He looked at his hands trembling on the table. He thought of Coretta and the baby sleeping in the next room. He realized that his intellectualism, his Hegel, his Kant, even his Gandhi, could not save him from the cold fear of a bullet. He bowed his head over a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Lord," he prayed out loud, "I am down here trying to do what is right, but Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm at the end of my powers." In the silence of that Montgomery kitchen, something happened that Martin would refer to for the rest of his life. He felt an inner voice saying, "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever." The fear didn't leave him, but it no longer controlled him. He had undergone a spiritual baptism. The midnight call had transformed a scholar into a prophet. 3 nights later, his house was bombed. When he arrived home to find his wife and child safe, but his porch shattered, a mob of black men stood outside with guns, ready for blood. Martin stood on the ruined porch and told them to put their weapons away. "We must meet hate with love," he said. The love force had survived its first explosion. The logistics of the beloved community. The boycott was a masterpiece of tactical genius. Since black citizens refused to ride the buses, the MIA organized a massive carpool. It was a private transportation system that rivaled the city. Over 300 cars, mostly rolling churches, funded by donations, moved 40,000 people a day. Martin spent his days in the war room, coordinating pickup points and negotiating with white car insurance companies that tried to cancel their policies under pressure from the state. He saw the dignity of the walk. He saw elderly women, their faces etched with the lines of 70 years of Jim Crow, walking miles to work in the heat and the rain. One story became the legend of the movement. An elderly woman, Mother Pollard, was asked if she wanted a ride. She declined, saying, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Martin realized that the red clay of Montgomery was no longer a place of stagnant tradition. It was being reshaped by the footsteps of a people who had discovered they were somebody. The Supreme Court and the empty bus. For 381 days, the buses of Montgomery ran empty, like ghost ships, as one reporter put it. The city's economy was bleeding, and its reputation was in tatters. The white power structure, led by the White Citizens Council, tried every legal and illegal trick to break the boycott. They arrested 89 leaders on an old anti-boycott law. But on November 13, 1956, the news reached the courthouse where Martin was being tried. The Supreme Court had ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. On December 21, 1956, at 5:55 a.m., Martin Luther King Jr. stood at a bus stop. When the bus pulled up, he boarded and sat in the front row. The driver, a white man who had likely spent the last year cursing King's name, looked at him and said, "I believe you're Dr. King." Martin replied with a polite, "Yes, I am." The victory was total, but as the bus pulled away, Martin noticed the look on the faces of the white passengers. They weren't converted, they were defeated. He realized that laws could desegregate a bus, but they couldn't integrate a heart. The movement had won a battle, but the war for the beloved community was just beginning. Conclusion: the burden of the crown. The Montgomery bus boycott ended, but the reluctant leader was gone forever. Martin Luther King Jr. was now a global figure. He had proven that nonviolence was not a weak philosophy for the classroom, but a tough philosophy for the street. He left Montgomery with a sense of destiny, but also with a sense of dread. He knew that the midnight call in his kitchen was not a one-time event. It was a permanent assignment. The red clay of Alabama had claimed him, and the rest of his life would be spent trying to live up to the promise he made over that cold cup of coffee. The power of the peaceful pulse. By the opening months of 1957, the victory in Montgomery had transformed Martin Luther King Jr. into a modern-day Moses in the eyes of the Black South. However, Martin was a realist. He knew that the victory on the buses was a localized fracture in a continental wall of oppression. Across the South, massive resistance was the new watchword of the white establishment. State legislatures were passing laws to outlaw the NAACP, and the Ku Klux Klan had traded their midnight rides for daylight bombings. The movement needed a heart, a central rhythmic pulse that could synchronize the disparate struggles of 1,000 southern towns. The gathering of the shepherds. In January 1957, the red clay of Georgia became the site of a historic assembly. Martin invited 60 black leaders, mostly ministers, to the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. These were men who understood that in the South, the black church was the only institution that the white man did not own, could not fire, and could not fully silence. Out of this meeting, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, was born. Its motto was bold and unapologetically spiritual: to save the soul of America. The SCLC was not designed to be a bureaucratic organization of lawyers. It was designed to be a movement of movements. Martin realized that while the NAACP fought the legal battles in the hushed halls of the Supreme Court, the SCLC would fight the moral battles in the dusty streets of the South. The peaceful pulse was not just a metaphor, it was a strategy. By using ministers as the primary organizers, King was tapping into the deepest cultural well of the black community. The pulpit became the headquarters, and the hymns became the marching orders. The architect of the strategy, Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker. Rustin, a master of logistics and a devotee of Gandhian nonviolence, arrived in the South to find King's home guarded by armed men. Rustin was the one who challenged King: if you are going to lead a nonviolent movement, you cannot have guns in your house. It was a painful, terrifying transition. But King listened. Rustin helped King refine the tactical genius of nonviolence, moving it from a personal conviction to a mass political weapon. Ella Baker, on the other hand, was the mother of the movement. She was a fierce advocate for grassroots democracy. She pushed King to look beyond his own charisma and focus on the little people. She set up the SCLC office in Atlanta, turning a vision into a functioning machine. The tension between King's leader-centric style and Baker's people-centric style was the friction that kept the SCLC's pulse strong. The tactical genius of constructive crisis. In his study at home, Martin spent hours refining the mechanics of nonviolent direct action. He knew that white moderates in the North were comfortable with gradualism. They wanted justice, but they wanted it to be quiet. Martin realized that quiet justice is no justice at all. He developed a philosophy of creative tension. The goal of the SCLC's campaigns was to create a situation so crisis-packed that it would inevitably open the door to negotiation. This was the peaceful pulse in action. Selection of the target. Choose a city or business that was a symbol of blatant racism. Training volunteers underwent sociodrama sessions where they were spit on and insulted to ensure they wouldn't retaliate. The confrontation, the march or sit-in. The media reflex, ensuring that the brutality of the police was captured by the cameras of the national press. Martin saw that when a peaceful black man in a suit was beaten by a white policeman in a uniform, the moral logic of the North was shattered. He was using the pulse to trigger the conscience of a nation that preferred to sleep. The shadow of death, I'm glad I didn't sneeze. The 4,000-word narrative of this period is incomplete without the Harlem stabbing. In September 1958, while King was signing books in a Harlem department store, a mentally ill woman named Isola, where Curry stepped forward and plunged a 7-inch ivory-handled letter opener into his chest. The blade rested against his aorta. The surgeons told him that if he had so much as sneezed, he would have bled to death instantly. While he lay in the hospital, he received a letter from a young white girl who wrote, "I'm just glad you didn't sneeze." This brush with death was a refining fire. It reaffirmed for Martin that his life was no longer his own. He spoke of the incident not with bitterness toward his attacker, but with a renewed sense of urgency. The peaceful pulse had almost been stopped by a single inch of steel, yet it only beat faster afterward. The pilgrimage to the source, India, 1959. In February 1959, Martin and Coretta traveled to India. For Martin, this was not a vacation, it was a pilgrimage to the source of his power. He met with followers of Gandhi and walked through the villages where Satyagraha had been born. He saw that India, despite its poverty, had a spiritual dignity that America lacked. He returned to the United States with a radicalized vision. He realized that the pulse of the American civil rights movement was part of a global world house. He told the SCLC staff, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." This global perspective gave the SCLC the moral authority to challenge not just local laws, but unjust systems. The student awakening and the sit-ins. By 1960, the SCLC's pulse began to race. In Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 college students sat at a whites-only lunch counter. They didn't wait for King's orders. They didn't wait for the NAACP's lawyers. They simply sat. The sit-in movement was the ultimate proof of King's tactical genius. It was simple, visual, and highly disruptive. Within weeks, sit-ins spread to 54 cities. Martin immediately threw his weight behind the students. He joined them in Atlanta, getting arrested and being sent to the brutal Reidsville State Prison. It was during this arrest that John F. Kennedy, then a presidential candidate, made a phone call to Coretta Scott King. That call, a small gesture of empathy, shifted the black vote and arguably won Kennedy the White House. Martin saw then that the peaceful pulse had the power to tip the scales of the highest office in the land. Conclusion: the machine is ready. As 1960 drew to a close, the SCLC was no longer a fledgling group of preachers. It was a battle-hardened organization with a sophisticated understanding of media, politics, and psychology. Martin Luther King Jr. had successfully institutionalized the peaceful pulse. He had taught a generation of black Americans that their greatest strength was not in their ability to kill, but in their ability to suffer for a cause without losing their dignity. He had created a tactical framework that turned every jail cell into a pulpit and every street corner into a classroom. But as he looked toward the coming decade, Martin knew the climate of fear was reaching a boiling point. The South was arming itself. The pulse would now have to face the fire. Letters from the shadows. In the spring of 1963, Birmingham, Alabama, was a city under siege by its own history. Known colloquially as Bombingham due to the 60 sticks of dynamite that had shattered black homes and churches over the previous decade, it was the most segregated city in the United States. The city's Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, was a man whose world was built on the binary of black and white, and he defended that boundary with the ferocity of a medieval warden. When Martin Luther King Jr. Arrived in Birmingham, he wasn't just entering a city, he was entering a cage. The strategy of Project C. The Birmingham campaign was born out of a desperate need for a victory. After the ambiguous results in Albany, Georgia, the SCLC leadership, led by the fiery Fred Shuttlesworth and the tactical genius Wyatt T. Walker, realized that the movement needed to strike at the heart of the Southern economy. They termed the plan Project C, Confrontation. The architecture of confrontation was precise. They didn't want a riot, they wanted a social crisis. They targeted the downtown department stores, Loveman's, Pizzett's, and Newberry's during the high-stakes Easter shopping season. By boycotting these stores and filling the sidewalks with protesters, they intended to force the white business elite to choose between their racism and their profits. Martin sat in room 30 of the Gaston Motel, the unofficial headquarters of the movement. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy silence of men who knew they might not see the end of the month. Martin was quieter than usual. He knew that Bull Connor was not like the police chiefs he had faced before. Connor didn't care about image, he cared about order, and he defined order as the total submission of the black population. The leap of faith. By April 12, 1963, Good Friday, the campaign was faltering. The city had obtained an injunction from a state court prohibiting any further protest. The SCLC was out of money for bail, and many local black leaders were urging Martin to retreat. Martin retreated to his room alone. He thought of his father's warnings, the empty bank accounts, and the thousands of people who were looking to him for a sign. He emerged from the room wearing a pair of blue denim work overalls, a visual signal that he was no longer a visitor or a scholar, but a laborer in the field of justice. "I think I have to make a leap of faith," he told his associates. He walked out of the Gaston Motel and straight into the waiting arms of the Birmingham police. As he was shoved into a squad car, he saw the faces of the onlookers, some terrified, some emboldened. He was being taken to the Birmingham City Jail, a place where the walls were thick enough to swallow a man's voice. The dark night of the soul. The first 24 hours in the Birmingham jail were a descent into psychological darkness. Martin was placed in solitary confinement. There was no light, no mattress, and no human contact. The cell was cold, smelling of stale urine and industrial bleach. In this shadow, Martin faced his deepest doubts. Without his advisors, without the roar of the crowd, and without his books, he was forced to confront the fundamental question, is nonviolence enough? He listened to the distant sounds of the city, the sirens, the shouts, the metallic clang of doors. He realized that if he were to die in this cell, the movement might dissolve into the very violence he had fought to prevent. However, it was in this silence that his intellectual clarity returned. He realized that he wasn't just a prisoner of Bull Connor, he was a prisoner of hope. When a friend smuggled in a newspaper, Martin saw a statement by 8 liberal white clergymen. They called his actions unwise and untimely. They told him to wait. The manifesto begins. The word wait was the spark. Martin began to write. He had no legal pads, so he started on the margins of the newspaper itself. When he ran out of margin space, he used scraps of paper smuggled in by his lawyer, even, according to legend, pieces of toilet paper. This was the creation of the letter from Birmingham jail. It was a document written from the gut, but directed at the mind. He didn't just write to the 8 clergymen, he wrote to the conscience of Western civilization. He addressed the white moderate with a searing honesty. "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion," he wrote, "that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice." He moved into a deep philosophical defense of civil disobedience. Drawing on the natural law tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas, he argued that an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law of the universe. To break an unjust law openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty is in fact the highest respect for law. This was the intellectual victory. He turned the criminal into the patriot. The pulse of the youth. When Martin was released from jail on April 20, the movement still lacked the mass numbers needed to break the city. This was when James Bevel, a young and eccentric SCLC strategist, proposed the Children's Crusade. Martin agonized over the decision. Using children meant putting them in the path of Bull Connor's dogs and hoses. But he also knew that the children of Birmingham were already living in a cage of segregation. They wanted to fight for their own futures. On May 2, D-Day, thousands of students skipped school and gathered at the 16th Street Baptist Church. They marched out in waves, singing "We Shall Overcome." Bull Connor, blinded by his own rage, unleashed the full power of the state. He brought out the high-pressure fire hoses, monitors that could strip the bark off a tree and knock a man unconscious from 50 feet away. He ordered his K-9 units to attack. The images were captured by television cameras and beamed across the globe. Americans in the North, who had long viewed the race problem as a Southern annoyance, were suddenly confronted with the sight of a German shepherd lunging at the throat of a teenage girl in a Sunday dress. The peaceful pulse had created a visual crisis that the world could no longer ignore. The Birmingham Accord. The brutality backfired. The business leaders of Birmingham, watching their city become a global pariah and their stores go empty, realized that segregation was too expensive to maintain. Behind the scenes, the Kennedy administration, finally moved by the letter and the images of the children, began to pressure the city to settle. On May 10, an agreement was signed. The lunch counters would be desegregated. The whites-only signs would come down. Black citizens would be hired in downtown stores. It was the most significant victory of the movement to date, but the cost was immense. That night, the Gaston Motel was bombed. The home of Martin's brother was destroyed. The KKK burned crosses on the hills overlooking the city. Martin realized that he had not just desegregated a city, he had declared war on an entire way of life. The power of the shadows. The letters from the shadows changed the trajectory of American history. Before Birmingham, civil rights was a series of local protests. After Birmingham, it was a national emergency. Martin had proven that a jail cell could be a more powerful platform than a pulpit. He had shown that the moral law was not just something discussed by philosophers in the North, but something that could be lived out by children in the South. As he left Birmingham for his next destination, Martin knew that the midnight call he had heard in his kitchen years ago was being answered by a whole nation. The letter from Birmingham jail was no longer just scraps of paper. It was the blueprint for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The shadows had finally begun to give way to the light. The Children's Crusade. By May 1963, the Birmingham campaign was suffocating. The adults of the city, burdened by the crushing reality of mortgages, grocery bills, and the very real threat of white employer retaliation, could no longer afford to go to jail. The movement was stagnant, and in the war room of the Gaston Motel, the air was thick with the scent of exhaustion. It was then that James Bevel, the SCLC's most eccentric and daring strategist, looked at the crowd of teenagers gathered at the 16th Street Baptist Church and proposed the unthinkable: let the children march. The tactical gamble, Bevel's vision. James Bevel's logic was as cold as it was brilliant. He argued that a child's jail cell was free. A child didn't have a job to lose or a family to support. Furthermore, he understood the visual narrative of the movement. If a 30-year-old black man was beaten by a policeman, the white North might dismiss it as a dispute. But if a 12-year-old girl in pigtails was attacked by a German shepherd, the world would see it for what it truly was: a manifestation of pure evil. Martin Luther King Jr. was tormented. He was a father of 4. He knew that Bull Connor's men didn't check birth certificates before swinging their batons. He agonized over the morality of using children as a shield. But after a long night of prayer, he realized that these children were already victims. They were born into a systemic cage that stunted their souls. Letting them march was not using them, it was giving them the agency to fight for their own lives. D-Day, the exit from the 16th Street Baptist Church. On May 2, 1963, a day known in movement history as D-Day, the atmosphere inside the 16th Street Baptist Church was electric. Over 1,000 students, ranging from college age down to primary school, had skipped classes. They weren't there to play, they were there to witness. They were organized into commando units. As they prepared to exit, they were given two things: a nonviolent 10 commandments and a sense of divine purpose. The doors opened, and the first wave of 50 children marched out, 2 by 2, singing, "We shall overcome." Bull Connor was waiting. He was a man who believed that fear was the only language the black community understood. He began barking orders. "Pick 'em up," he yelled. The police began stuffing children into school buses, which had been converted into makeshift paddy wagons. By the end of the day, nearly 1,000 children were in custody. They went to jail laughing, singing, and waving their fingers at the cameras. The fear machine of Birmingham had jammed. Double D-Day, the unleashing of the hoses. If the first day was a psychological victory, the second day, Double D-Day, was a moral apocalypse. More children arrived. Bull Connor realized that he was running out of jail space and losing control, decided to escalate. He brought out the monitors, industrial-strength fire hoses. These weren't garden hoses. These were high-pressure water cannons designed to knock down walls. When the children gathered at Kelly Ingram Park, Connor gave the order. The water hit the protesters with a sound like a gunshot. It swept children down the street, tumbling them like ragdolls against the brick walls of the medical buildings. It ripped the bark off the trees and tore the clothes off the protesters' backs. Then came the dogs. Connor ordered his K-9 units into the crowd. The images captured that day of a white policeman holding a snarling German shepherd as it lunged at the stomach of a 15-year-old boy in a cardigan were developed in darkrooms and splashed across the front pages of newspapers from London to Tokyo. The sensory nightmare of the fairgrounds. To understand the 4,000-word depth of this struggle, one must look at where the children were taken. The jails were full, so the city used the Birmingham Fairgrounds as a temporary prison. Thousands of children were kept in open-air animal pens. It rained. They were cold, hungry, and surrounded by guards who taunted them with racial slurs. Yet the pulse did not stop. They turned the fairgrounds into a massive choir. They sang freedom songs until the guards grew tired of hearing them. This was the self-purification Martin had taught at Crozer. The children were proving that you could imprison a body, but you could not imprison a song. The shift in the White House, from politics to morality. Back in Washington, President John F. Kennedy was shown the photographs. He was reportedly so sickened that he had to leave the room. For 2 years, Kennedy had treated the civil rights movement as a political nuisance to be managed, but Birmingham changed him. He realized that this wasn't just a Southern problem, it was an American disgrace. The visual narrative had worked. The children of Alabama had done what the lawyers and the preachers could not. They had made the cost of segregation visible to the eyes of the world. Kennedy began to realize that he could no longer stay neutral. The midnight call that Martin heard in his kitchen was now ringing in the Oval Office. The conclusion, the victory of the innocents. By May 10, the Birmingham business leaders surrendered. They couldn't stand the sight of their city being portrayed as a barbarian outpost on the evening news. The children's crusade had broken the back of Jim Crow in its most fortified stronghold. As Martin Luther King Jr. stood before the press to announce the desegregation of Birmingham, he looked at the children who had been bitten and hosed. He saw in them the new Negro, a generation that would never again be afraid. The red clay of Georgia had been a place of origin, but the iron of Birmingham had been the place of testing. The children had passed the test. The movement was no longer a series of protests, it was an unstoppable force. The visual narrative had been rewritten, and as Martin looked toward the horizon, he saw the road leading to the nation's capital. The children had opened the gate, now the whole nation would have to march through it. The Great Gathering at the Malls. By the blistering summer of 1963, the momentum of Birmingham had reached a fever pitch. The peaceful pulse was no longer a regional heartbeat, it was a national vibration. However, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that the victory in Alabama was fragile. President John F. Kennedy had finally introduced a civil rights bill, but it was suffocating in the dark corridors of a recalcitrant Congress. The movement needed a grand stage, a moment so massive that it would force the American government to either honor its founding documents or admit its hypocrisy. That stage was to be the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The architect of the impossible, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. While Martin Luther King Jr. was the voice of the march, the logistical miracle was the work of two other men. A. Philip Randolph, the elder statesman of the Black labor movement, had dreamed of a march on Washington since 1941. He was the moral anchor. Beside him was the tactical genius, Bayard Rustin. Rustin was given only 8 weeks to organize a gathering of 250,000 people. Working out of a cramped brownstone in Harlem, he managed a staff of volunteers that functioned like a military unit. They had to coordinate 2,000 buses, 21 chartered trains, and thousands of private cars. The logistics were a nightmare of precision. They had to arrange for thousands of portable toilets, medical tents staffed by volunteer doctors, and a massive sound system that would ensure Martin's voice reached from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument. Rustin even coordinated the Freedom Meal, 80,000 cheese sandwiches, to ensure no one went hungry. This was the silent infrastructure of justice. Without the cheese sandwiches and the sound systems, the dream would have remained a whisper in the wind. The city of fear, Washington on the brink. As August 28 approached, the city of Washington, D.C., was paralyzed by fear. The white establishment expected a riot. The Pentagon put 19,000 troops on alert. Hospitals canceled elective surgeries, and liquor stores were ordered to close. The prevailing narrative in the press was one of imminent chaos. Martin Luther King Jr. felt this pressure more than anyone. He stayed at the Willard Hotel the night before, refining his speech until the early morning hours. He knew that if a single bottle was thrown, or if a single window was smashed, the Civil Rights Bill would be dead. He was walking a tightrope between divine impatience and total nonviolence. The gathering, a sea of humanity. On the morning of the 28th, the sun rose over a city that looked like it was preparing for an invasion. But instead of an army of rioters, an army of believers arrived. They came from the red clay of Georgia, the sharecropping fields of Mississippi, and the skyscrapers of New York. They were 250,000 strong, a quarter of whom were white. They were laborers in overalls, students in cardigans, and Hollywood stars in dark glasses. They stood shoulder to shoulder around the reflecting pool, a human mosaic that represented the beloved community Martin had preached about for years. The atmosphere was not one of anger, but of a sacred picnic. There was the smell of damp grass, the sound of folk singers like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, and an unshakable sense of dignity. The peaceful pulse had become a collective breath. The friction behind the podium. Behind the scenes, the great gathering was nearly derailed by internal friction. The younger generation, represented by John Lewis of SNCC, had prepared a speech that was a firebrand manifesto. It criticized the Kennedy administration as being too little, too late. The older leaders were terrified. They feared that Lewis's rhetoric would alienate the very politicians they needed. In a frantic negotiation held literally under the statue of Abraham Lincoln, while the program was already beginning, Martin and A. Philip Randolph persuaded Lewis to tone down his remarks. This was the internal crucible, the struggle to balance the raw rage of the oppressed with the strategic requirements of the political stage. The moment from manuscript to prophecy. When Martin finally stepped to the podium, he was the final speaker of a long, hot afternoon. He began with a prepared text, a scholarly, somewhat formal speech about the promissory note of the Constitution. But midway through, something shifted. Mahalia Jackson, the Queen of Gospel, shouted from behind him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." In that moment, Martin pushed his prepared notes to the side of the lectern. He transitioned from lecturer to prophet. He leaned into the cadence of the Ebenezer pulpit. "I have a dream," he thundered. His voice, amplified by Rustin's logistical miracle, rolled across the mall like a tidal wave. He spoke of sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners sitting down together at the table of brotherhood. He spoke of a nation where children would be judged by the content of their character. It was a linguistic masterstroke. He took the red clay of Georgia and the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado and wove them into a single American tapestry. He wasn't just asking for a law, he was redefining the American identity. The aftermath, the Oval Office, and the reality check. After the march, the leaders were invited to the White House. President Kennedy, who had watched the speech on television, greeted them with the words, "I have a dream too." For the first time, the movement felt the wind of the presidency at its back. But as the crowds dispersed and the 2,000 buses rolled out of Washington, the soaring hope was met with a cold reality. Martin knew that the dream was a mountaintop vision, but the struggle was still in the valley. Only 18 days later, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham would be bombed, killing 4 little girls. The logistical miracle had been a success, but the architecture of justice was still under construction. The secular liturgy. The 1963 March on Washington was the high-water mark of the nonviolent movement. It proved that 250,000 people could gather in the heart of power and remain peaceful. It showed the tactical genius of combining labor, religion, and student activism into a single pulse. Martin Luther King Jr. left Washington no longer just a black leader, but as the moral architect of America. He had given the nation a mirror, and for one brief afternoon, the nation liked what it saw. The red clay had been brought to the marble halls, and the world would never be the same. The Fragile Alliance. The year 1964 was supposed to be the year of fulfillment. The Civil Rights Act had finally been signed into law, theoretically ending the era of legal apartheid in America. But for those on the front lines in the Deep South, the law felt like a distant rumor. As the movement moved from the symbolic victories of lunch counters to the structural victories of political power, the unity that had defined the March on Washington began to dissolve. Martin Luther King Jr., the man who had been the glue of the coalition, found himself standing on a fault line that was widening with every passing day. This was the era of the Fragile Alliance, where the peaceful pulse faced its most internal and agonizing challenge. The Delord conflict, SCLC vs. SNCC. The primary tension within the movement was a clash of cultures and generations. On one side stood the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by King. It was an organization of ministers, deeply hierarchical and focused on top-down, charismatic leadership. On the other side was SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC workers. They were the youth, tough, grassroots-oriented, and increasingly skeptical of King's theatrical style. The SNCC workers were the ones living in the Black Belt of Mississippi and Alabama year-round. They were the ones getting beaten in back alleys while the national cameras were elsewhere. They began to resent King's pattern. He would arrive in a city with a flurry of media, lead a march, go to jail for a few days, and then fly back to Atlanta or New York to raise funds. The students sarcastically nicknamed him Delord. They felt that King's presence turned a local struggle into a personality cult. They wanted a movement that was group-centered, not leader-centered. This friction was not just about ego, it was about the architecture of change. King believed in moral suasion, using nonviolence to win the heart of the white moderate. The students were beginning to believe that the white moderate didn't have a heart to win. They wanted to organize local communities to seize power for themselves, regardless of what the white conscience thought. The Blood of Freedom Summer. The summer of 1964, known as Freedom Summer, was designed to be a massive show of force. SNCC and SCLC invited hundreds of white Northern college students to Mississippi to help with voter registration. The logic was cynical but necessary. The country didn't care when black people were killed in Mississippi, but they would care if the sons and daughters of the white elite were in danger. The cost was immediate. 3 workers, James Chaney, black, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, white, disappeared in Neshoba County. Their bodies were found weeks later in an earthen dam, beaten and shot. For the SNCC workers, this was a radicalizing moment. They saw that the FBI only launched a full-scale investigation because 2 of the victims were white. The red clay of Mississippi had swallowed the idealism of the youth. They began to feel that nonviolence was a trick used to keep black people defenseless while they were slaughtered. Martin Luther King Jr. tried to maintain the peaceful pulse, but the heartbeat of the youth was becoming a rhythmic, angry drum of self-defense. The shadow of the urban prophet, Malcolm X. As the Southern movement fractured, a different voice was echoing in the northern ghettos. Malcolm X, while Martin preached integration, Malcolm preached separation. While Martin spoke of the beloved community, Malcolm spoke of the white devil. To the young radicals in SNCC, Malcolm X provided the intellectual truth force they felt King lacked. Malcolm didn't ask for a seat at the table. He questioned why anyone would want to sit at a table owned by their oppressor. Martin and Malcolm met only once, on March 26, 1964, during the Senate debates on the Civil Rights Act. It was a brief encounter lasting less than a minute, but the image of the two men shaking hands haunted the movement. Malcolm's presence forced Martin to be more radical. He realized that if he couldn't deliver real results, jobs, housing, and an end to police brutality, the masses would turn away from his dream and toward Malcolm, nightmare. Martin was forced into a delicate dance. He had to maintain his nonviolent credentials to keep his white allies, while adopting a tougher rhetoric to keep his black base. The Atlantic City betrayal, the death of liberalism. The most profound break in the fragile alliance occurred at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, led by the legendary Fannie Lou Hamer, arrived to challenge the legitimacy of the all-white, segregationist, regular Mississippi delegation. Hamer's testimony about being beaten in a jail cell for trying to vote was so powerful that President Lyndon B. Johnson held an impromptu press conference just to knock her off the live television feed. Behind the scenes, LBJ pressured King and other mainstream leaders to force a compromise. The offer, 2 at-large seats for the MFDP, and a promise that the rules would change by 1968. Martin Luther King Jr., the pragmatist, urged the MFDP to accept the deal. He called it a victory of recognition. But Hamer and the SNCC students were furious. "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats," Hamer famously said. The Atlantic City betrayal taught the youth a bitter lesson. The American political system was not a moral arena, it was a marketplace. They saw King as a man who had been co-opted by the white establishment. The alliance between the prophet and the students was now permanently cracked. The Greenwood explosion, Black Power. The tension culminated in 1966 during the March Against Fear. James Meredith, the first black student at the University of Mississippi, had been shot while attempting a solo march. King and Stokely Carmichael, the new radical head of SNCC, took up the mantle. As they marched through the blistering heat of the Mississippi Delta, the debate over the movement's soul became public. Carmichael, who had been arrested 27 times, had reached his limit. On a night in Greenwood, Mississippi, after being released from yet another jail cell, Carmichael climbed onto a flatbed truck and shouted to the crowd, "We been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we gonna start saying now is Black Power." The crowd erupted. The peaceful pulse was drowned out by the roar of Black Power. Martin, standing just a few feet away, felt a deep sense of dread. He knew that the phrase would terrify white America and give the media an excuse to paint the movement as a black version of the KKK. He spent the next several days in intense, late-night arguments with Carmichael. Martin argued that Black Power was a slogan without a program. Carmichael argued that nonviolence was a program without power. They reached a fragile truce to finish the march, but the movement was now 2 separate streams flowing in 2 different directions. The intellectual synthesis toward a radical king. To reach the 4,000-word depth, one must look at how Martin evolved to meet this challenge. He didn't just reject Black Power, he tried to understand its root. He realized that the youth were angry because the Civil Rights Act had not put bread on their tables or stopped the rats in their tenements. In his final years, Martin's philosophy shifted. He began to talk about the triple evils of American society: racism, materialism, and militarism. He realized that integration was a hollow victory if you were integrating into a burning house. He began to speak of a restructuring of the entire American architecture. He was attempting to hold the fragile alliance together by becoming more radical himself. He moved to Chicago to live in a slum. He spoke out against the Vietnam War. He began to organize a poor people's campaign. He was trying to prove to the Black Power advocates that nonviolence could be a revolutionary, not just a reformist, force. The loneliness of the middle path. By 1967, the fragile alliance was gone. The SNCC had expelled its white members. The Black Panthers were patrolling the streets of Oakland with shotguns, and the SCLC was struggling to remain relevant. Martin Luther King Jr. was now a man alone in the middle. He was too radical for the white moderates and too conservative for the black militants. He was being attacked by the FBI, the press, and his own former allies, but he refused to surrender the peaceful pulse. He understood that the architecture of justice was more complex than he had envisioned in the red clay of Georgia. It required more than just love. It required a redistribution of economic power. As he looked towards Selma and then Memphis, he knew that the movement had lost its unity, but it had gained its truth. The alliance was broken, but the prophet was finally seeing the whole world. Bloody Sunday on the bridge. By 1965, the civil rights movement had moved into its most dangerous phase. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had integrated the lunch counters and the movie theaters, but in the rural South, the architecture of justice was still missing its foundation, the right to vote. In Selma, Alabama, a city where black citizens made up half the population, but only 1% of the registered voters, the peaceful pulse was about to meet its most violent resistance. For Martin Luther King Jr., Selma was not just another protest, it was the final, desperate struggle to force the American conscience to face the ballot box. The anatomy of disenfranchisement. To understand Selma, one must understand the literacy test. It was a psychological and bureaucratic weapon designed to make registration impossible. Black citizens were asked to interpret obscure sections of the Alabama Constitution or count the number of jelly beans in a jar. If they failed to satisfy the white registrar, which they always did, they were turned away. Martin chose Selma because he knew the local sheriff, Jim Clark, was the twin soul of Birmingham's Bull Connor. Clark was a man of explosive temper who wore a button that simply said, "Never." Martin understood that to get the world's attention, he needed a villain who would act out the brutality of white supremacy in front of the cameras. This was the tactical genius of the SCLC. They didn't go where it was safe. They went where the social crisis was most acute. The murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. The momentum for the Bloody Sunday March didn't start on a bridge. It started in a dark cafe in nearby Marion, Alabama. During a night march, state troopers turned off the streetlights and began beating protesters in the dark. A young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson tried to protect his mother and grandfather from a trooper's baton and was shot in the stomach. He died 8 days later. The movement was grieving and furious. At Jackson's funeral, the idea for a 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery was born. It was to be a petition in the form of a parade. Martin, however, was in Atlanta, caught in a tangle of organizational duties and exhaustion. He didn't realize that the peaceful pulse was about to reach its breaking point on a Sunday morning in March. The Edmund Pettus Bridge, the arrival of chaos. On March 7, 1965, a day now burned into the American memory as Bloody Sunday, 600 protesters, led by John Lewis of SNCC and Hosea Williams of the SCLC, began their walk. They were dressed in their Sunday best, carrying knapsacks with fruit and toothbrushes, expecting to go to jail. As they reached the crest of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they looked down and saw a blue wall of Alabama state troopers. Beside them were Sheriff Clark's posse, some on horseback, armed with whips and cattle prods. The air was silent, save for the whistling wind over the Alabama River. When the protesters stopped to pray, the order was given, "Advance." What followed was a massacre. The troopers used tear gas, making the bridge look like a battlefield. They swung nightsticks wrapped in barbed wire. They rode their horses into the crowd, trampling the elderly and the young alike. John Lewis, his skull fractured, remembered the world turning red and then black. The visual shock, the conscience of the nation. The footage of Bloody Sunday was flown to New York and broadcast that night, interrupting the movie judgment at Nuremberg. The irony was lost on no one. Americans were watching a film about Nazi atrocities while simultaneously watching American citizens being gassed and beaten on their own soil. The reaction was a national seizure of the spirit. Thousands of people, priests, rabbis, nuns, and laborers, dropped everything and headed for Selma. Martin Luther King Jr. issued a nationwide call, "Come join us." The peaceful pulse was now a roar. Selma had become the Stalingrad of the civil rights movement. Turnaround Tuesday and the political chess match. 2 days later, Martin led 2,000 people back to the bridge, but he was caught in a pincer movement. A federal judge had issued an injunction against the march, and President Lyndon B. Johnson was begging him to wait. In a moment that deeply wounded his relationship with the younger radicals, Martin led the march to the edge of the police line, knelt to pray, and then turned back. This was Turnaround Tuesday. To the students of SNCC, it was a betrayal. To Martin, it was a tactical necessity. He knew that if he defied a federal judge, he would lose the legal protection he needed to finish the march. He was playing the long game of the ballot box. We shall overcome the LBJ transformation. While Selma was under siege, a transformation was occurring in the White House. LBJ, a master of political leverage, realized that the blood on the bridge had made his position untenable. On March 15, he went before a joint session of Congress to introduce the Voting Rights Act. In a speech that brought Martin to tears, the President of the United States, a Texan with a Southern accent, adopted the movement's own anthem. "It is the effort of American Negroes to write the essentials of liberty into the combined harmony of our nation," Johnson said, "and we shall overcome." Martin, watching from a friend's house in Selma, wept. It was the first time he had seen a president truly adopt the moral language of the red clay. The march to Montgomery, the symbolic victory. The final march from Selma to Montgomery was a 5-day odyssey. They walked through the rain and the mud of Lowndes County, sleeping in tents in the fields of black farmers. By the time they reached the Alabama state capitol, the crowd had grown to 25,000. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, under the very windows where Jefferson Davis had been inaugurated, Martin gave one of his most powerful orations. "How long? Not long," he thundered, "because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." The price of the vote. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law in August 1965. It was the movement's final, greatest legislative triumph, but the red clay was still hungry for blood. Only hours after the march ended, a white volunteer named Viola Liuzzo was murdered by the KKK while driving protesters back to Selma. Martin realized that the ballot box was a victory, but it was not a cure. Selma had forced the American conscience to confront its laws, but it had not yet confronted its heart. As he looked back at the bridge, Martin knew that the peaceful pulse had survived its most brutal test, but the road ahead would lead him out of the South and into a different, darker wilderness. The pen of progress. The morning of August 6, 1965, was a symphony of marble and light. As Martin Luther King Jr. walked through the rotunda of the United States Capitol, he was surrounded by the ghosts of American history, statues of men who had once written laws to keep his ancestors in chains. Today, however, the law was changing its mind. He was there to witness the signing of the Voting Rights Act, VRA, a moment that many believed was the final nail in the coffin of the Old South. President Lyndon B. Johnson, a man of towering physical presence and even larger political ambition, picked up a fountain pen and with a few strokes of ink, abolished the literacy tests, the poll taxes, and the centuries of state-sponsored silencing that had defined the red clay of Georgia. For a few hours, the peaceful pulse felt like a victory march. Martin held the souvenir pen in his hand like a holy relic. He allowed himself the luxury of an illusion, the idea that the architecture of justice was finally complete. He believed that the ballot box was the great leveler. He envisioned a South where black sheriffs would protect black families and where the black belt would become a belt of prosperity. But as he left the Capitol, a cold wind of reality began to blow. He realized that while the pen of progress had changed the law of the land, it had not touched the law of the street. The echoes of the rotunda. The ceremony itself was an exercise in high-level political theater. Johnson had invited the giants of the movement, Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Ralph Abernathy. As the president signed the document, he looked at King and said, "Martin, this is a great day." And it was. The VRA was the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed. Within months, 250,000 new black voters were registered in the South. However, even in that room, there was a sense of an ending. The Big Six, civil rights organizations, were already beginning to look in different directions. The NAACP wanted to focus on the courts, SNCC wanted to focus on grassroots power, and Martin was looking at the horizon, sensing that the struggle was moving from public accommodations to human dignity. He realized that a black man in Mississippi could now vote for a mayor, but he still couldn't afford to buy a house in a white neighborhood. The post-racial victory was a thin veneer over a deep, structural rot. The 5-day dream and the Watts explosion. The celebration of the pen of progress lasted exactly 5 days. On August 11, 1965, the illusion was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and the smell of burning rubber. In the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, a routine traffic stop by a white motorcycle cop sparked a 6-day explosion of rage. This was not the peaceful pulse of Selma. This was the fire of frustration. As Martin watched the television footage of Los Angeles burning, 34 dead, over 1,000 injured, and $40 million in property damage, he felt a profound sense of failure. He realized that the dream he had articulated in Washington 2 years prior had never reached the West Coast. He rushed to Watts, hoping to use his moral authority to stop the bleeding, but when he arrived, the reception was chilling. For the first time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was booed. He stood before a group of young men in the smoldering ruins of a grocery store, and they laughed at him. "We don't need your nonviolence, Doc," one teenager shouted. "We need a way out of this hell. Your voting rights don't put meat in our refrigerators. Your civil rights don't stop the cops from kicking our doors down in the middle of the night." In that moment, Martin's moral compass underwent a radical recalciation. He saw that the red clay of the South was a visible enemy, but the gray concrete of the northern and western ghettos was an invisible prison. The VRA had fixed the South's illegal heart, but it had done nothing for the North's immoral economy. The anatomy of a slum beyond the ballot. Returning from Watts, Martin began to analyze the secondary tier of racism. He realized that the Voting Rights Act had targeted de jure segregation, segregation by law, but the North was defined by de facto segregation, segregation by circumstance. In the North, there were no whites-only signs, yet black families were trapped in high-rent, rat-infested tenements. They attended crumbling schools, while white children a few miles away in the suburbs had the best resources in the world. They were the last hired and first fired. Martin told his staff at the SCLC, "We have won the right to sit at a lunch counter, but we haven't won the money to buy a hamburger." This was the realization that would dominate the rest of his life. The pen of progress had signed a check, but when the black man went to the Bank of American Justice, the check was returned marked insufficient funds. The breaking of the LBJ bond. The VRA was the peak of the King-Johnson alliance, and it was also its funeral. Lyndon Johnson felt that he had given the black community enough. He was a politician of transactions, and he expected the movement to behave and support him blindly in exchange for the law. But as Martin moved toward a critique of the Vietnam War and northern poverty, LBJ felt betrayed. The president's focus was shifting toward the jungles of Southeast Asia. He began to see Martin not as a partner, but as a troublemaker who didn't know his place. Martin, on the other hand, saw a terrifying connection. The billions of dollars being spent to save democracy in Vietnam were being stolen from the war on poverty in America. The pen of progress was being used to sign death warrants for young black men sent to fight in a war they didn't understand, while their mothers were still being evicted from northern slums. The alliance that had built the architecture of justice was crumbling under the weight of a global conflict. The illusion of the post-racial South. Even in the South, where the VRA was supposedly a total victory, the reality was grim. White supremacists had simply evolved. Since they could no longer legally stop black people from voting, they used economic terrorism. Martin received reports of black plantation workers being fired the day after they registered to vote. He heard of banks calling in loans on black-owned businesses. He realized that the ballot box was a weapon, but it was a weapon that required an economic shield to use effectively. He began to describe the South not as fixed, but as transitioning from a blatant tyranny to a sophisticated one. The call to the North, Chicago. By the end of 1965, Martin knew he had to leave the comfort of the South. He had to prove that nonviolence could work in the urban jungle. He decided to move his family into a slum apartment in Chicago. His advisors were terrified. They told him that the northern mobs were more violent than the southern ones because their hatred was unburdened by religious tradition. In the South, even the Klansmen claimed to be a Christian. In the North, the racism was secular, cold, and based on property values. Martin ignored the warnings. He wanted to show that the peaceful pulse was universal. He wanted to challenge the malice in the North. He realized that if he couldn't break the slums of Chicago, then the dream he had spoken of at the Mall would be revealed as a regional hallucination. The radicalization of the dreamer. The pen of progress had brought a sense of closure to an era of protest, but for Martin, it opened a terrifying new chapter. He was no longer the safe, black leader that white America could applaud. He was becoming a revolutionary. He began to speak of a guaranteed basic income. He spoke of socializing the health system. He was moving away from civil rights and toward human rights. He understood that the temporary illusion of victory in 1965 had been a necessary step, but it was not the destination. As the year ended, the man who had been the Michael King Jr. of the Georgia Clay was now a global prophet who realized that the architecture of justice required more than just new laws. It required a new America. He looked toward the Chicago skyline, not with the hope of the 1963 dream, but with the tough-mindedness of a man who knew he was entering the most difficult battle of his life. Malice in the North. In the winter of 1966, the peaceful pulse moved into a different climate. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. packed his bags and moved into a third-floor walk-up apartment at 1550 South Hamlin Avenue in the Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago. This was not a visit, it was an occupation. For the first time, a Nobel Peace Prize winner was living in a slum. The air was thick with the scent of coal soot and garbage, and the windows were caked with the frost of a Chicago winter that seemed to mock the warmth of the Southern dream. Martin had come north to prove that nonviolence could heal the ghetto, but he was about to discover that Northern racism was a different, more elusive, and more deadly beast. The myth of the liberal North. For decades, the American North had marketed itself as a sanctuary of progress. It was the land of the Great Migration, where black Southerners fled to escape the noose and the cross. But as Martin walked the streets of Lawndale, he saw that the promised land was actually a sophisticated prison. In the South, the architecture of segregation was built of signs, whites only, colored entrance. In the North, the architecture was built of redlining and restrictive covenants. It was invisible but unbreakable. Black families were squeezed into overcrowded kitchenette apartments where the rent was higher than in white suburbs, but the services, trash collection, education, policing, were non-existent. Martin realized that the northern white man didn't care if a black man sat next to him on a bus. He cared if that black man moved into the house next door. This was real estate racism, a malice rooted not in theological tradition, but in property values and the preservation of white social islands. The encounter with Mayor Daley. If Bull Connor was a bludgeon, Mayor Richard J. Daley was a scalpel. Daley was the king of Chicago, the head of a political machine that operated on patronage and silence. Unlike the Southern governors who shouted racial slurs, Daley welcomed King to the city with a smile and a handshake. "We don't have slums in Chicago," Daley famously remarked, even as Martin stood in an apartment where the radiator was cold and the rats outnumbered the children. Daley's strategy was to suffocate with kindness and bureaucracy. He appointed black sub-leaders to the machine to maintain a facade of integration while ensuring that the power architecture remained white. Martin realized he was fighting a shadow enemy. In the South, you knew where the front line was. In Chicago, the front line was a city council meeting, a bank loan officer's desk, and a hidden contract. The Battle of Gage Park, worse than Mississippi. The tension finally boiled over during the open housing marches in the summer of 1966. Martin led a group of protesters into Gage Park, a working-class white neighborhood on the southwest side. He expected some heckling, but what he encountered was a tidal wave of hate. Thousands of white residents lined the streets, screaming racial epithets that made the Birmingham mob seem polite. They threw rocks, bottles, and bricks. A large stone struck Martin in the head, knocking him to one knee. As he wiped the blood from his forehead, he looked into the eyes of the white crowd and saw something he hadn't seen in the South: a raw, existential terror. These weren't Klansmen in robes. They were ordinary Americans, housewives, factory workers, and students who believed that the presence of a black person would physically destroy their world. "I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama," Martin said that evening, his voice trembling with a rare touch of despair, "mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago. The sensory nightmare of the ghetto." To understand the 4,000-word depth of this chapter, one must walk through the Hamlin Avenue apartment. Martin and Coretta lived there to experience what they called the psychology of the slum. Describe the sound of the L train screaming past at midnight. Describe the leaden eyes of the young men standing on the corners, men who had been born into a systemic cage and had no faith in a dream that was spoken in a southern accent. Martin realized that his love force was failing here because the target was not a person, but an economy. The slumlord was often a man who lived miles away and didn't even know his tenants' names. How do you love a corporation? How do you nonviolently protest a mortgage interest rate? The Summit Agreement, a hollow victory. After weeks of marches and the threat of a massive demonstration that would shut down the city's expressways, Mayor Daley finally came to the negotiating table. On August 26, the Summit Agreement was signed. The city promised to enforce fair housing laws, and the Chicago Real Estate Board promised to stop discriminatory practices. Martin called it a victory, but the younger activists in the Fragile Alliance, like those in SNCC, called it a sellout. They were right. Once the cameras left and Martin moved his bags out of Hamlin Avenue, Daley's machine quietly ignored the agreement. The malice in the North had won by outweighting the profit. The radicalization of the Chicago King. Chicago was the Gethsemane of the North for Martin. It broke his heart, but it sharpened his mind. He realized that the civil rights phase of the movement was dead. Giving a man the right to vote was useless if he lived in a rat-infested apartment he couldn't afford to leave. He began to formulate the Poor People's Campaign. He realized that the enemy was not white people, but a system of poverty that required a permanent underclass to function. He began to speak of a radical redistribution of economic power. He was no longer just a black leader, he was becoming a class warrior. This shift made him the most dangerous man in America in the eyes of the FBI. The elusive beast. Martin left Chicago with the realization that the North was the real America. The South was a peculiar aberration, but the North, hidden malice, the racism disguised as economic logic, was the true foundation of the country. The peaceful pulse had survived the fire hoses of Birmingham and the horses of Selma, but it had been bruised by the bricks of Gage Park. As he looked back at the Chicago skyline, Martin knew that the architecture of justice would require nothing less than a total revolution of values. He had tackled the slums, and the slums had shown him the dark heart of the American dream. The prophet's lonely path. By 1967, the moral landscape of America had become a jagged wasteland. The red clay of Georgia was now being shipped across the world in the form of young soldiers sent to fight in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer the darling of the American liberal establishment. He was a man haunted by the midnight call of a different kind. He realized that he could no longer preach nonviolence to the youth of the northern slums, while his own government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. On April 4, 1967, he stepped into the pulpit of the majestic Riverside Church in New York City to deliver a speech that would permanently sever his bond with the White House and lead him down a path of profound isolation. The agony of silence. For 2 years, Martin had kept a cautious silence on the Vietnam War. His advisors, including Bayard Rustin and many in the SCLC, begged him not to speak out. They argued that criticizing President Lyndon B. Johnson's war would be political suicide. LBJ had been the movement's greatest ally, the man who signed the Voting Rights Act. To break with him was to lose access to the levers of power. But Martin's conscience was in a state of civil war. He saw the Great Society programs, the war on poverty, being strangled by the fiscal requirements of the war in Vietnam. He saw the cruel irony of black and white boys who couldn't sit together in a school in Chicago, being sent to kill and die together in a rice paddy. While vacationing in Jamaica, he looked at a magazine spread showing the charred bodies of Vietnamese children burned by American napalm. He pushed his plate away and said, "I will never be silent again." Beyond Vietnam, the Riverside Declaration. The air inside Riverside Church was heavy with expectation. Over 3,000 people were packed into the Gothic nave. Martin's speech, titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, was not merely a protest against a war, it was a radical diagnosis of the American soul. He spoke with a somber, steady cadence. He argued that the war was a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. He identified the triple evils: racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. He called for a revolution of values, arguing that a nation that spends more on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. He didn't just criticize the policy, he humanized the enemy. He spoke of the Vietnamese peasants who saw the Americans not as liberators, but as new colonizers. In that moment, Martin transitioned from a civil rights leader to a global human rights prophet. He was no longer just talking about the red clay of Georgia, he was talking about the red clay of the world. The backlash, the loneliest man in America. The reaction was immediate and venomous. The Fragile Alliance didn't just crack, it shattered. The New York Times and the Washington Post, newspapers that had previously praised King's nonviolence in the South, now denounced him. They called his speech a tragic error and accused him of damaging the cause of his own people. The NAACP and the Urban League issued statements distancing themselves from him, fearing that the movement's funding would dry up. President Johnson was reportedly livid, feeling that King had stabbed him in the back. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, increased their surveillance to a fever pitch, labeling King the most dangerous man in America. Martin found himself in a terrifying void. He was too radical for the white liberals and still too nonviolent for the black power militants. He would walk through airports and see former allies turn their heads to avoid making eye contact. The peaceful pulse was now beating in a vacuum of solitude. The sensory weight of the lonely path. To understand the 4,000-word depth of this period, one must look at the physical toll on Martin. He was 38 years old, but his doctors said he had the heart of a 60-year-old. Described the exhaustion in his eyes as he sat in the SCLC offices in Atlanta, surrounded by ringing phones and stacks of hate mail. Described the midnight call becoming a constant companion. He suffered from bouts of deep depression. He felt that the dream he had spoken of in 1963 had become a nightmare. He saw the cities of America burning in the long hot summer of 1967, Newark, Detroit, and he felt that his message of love was being drowned out by the screams of the rioters and the roar of the war machines. The radical vision, the Poor People's Campaign. Instead of retreating, the lonely prophet pushed further. He realized that the only way to save the soul of America was to unite the poor of all races: white Appalachian miners, Latino farm workers, Native Americans, and black slum dwellers into a single, unyielding force. This was the Poor People's Campaign. The plan was to descend on Washington, D.C., and build a resurrection city of shanties on the National Mall. They would engage in massive civil disobedience until the government restructured the economy. Martin was no longer asking for the right to vote. He was asking for the right to eat and the right to a guaranteed income. This was his most radical architecture of justice, and it terrified the American power structure more than anything he had done in Selma or Birmingham. The philosophical synthesis, the World House. During this lonely period, Martin worked on his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? In it, he articulated the concept of the World House. He argued that because of modern technology and the network of mutuality, the whole world had become a single neighborhood. He realized that peace in Atlanta was impossible without peace in Saigon. He understood that poverty in the Mississippi Delta was linked to the greed of the global economic system. He was calling for a global citizenship that transcended race and nation. This was the intellectual peak of his journey, the realization that the red clay was one soil and we are all its children. Conclusion: the preacher of the wilderness. Martin Luther King Jr. entered the final year of his life as a man of sorrows. He had lost his friends, his political influence, and his popularity, but he had gained his soul. The lonely path had led him to a place of absolute moral clarity. He knew that the midnight call was leading him toward a final confrontation. As he looked toward the garbage workers' strike in Memphis, he wasn't looking for a win or a headline. He was looking to stand with the least of these. He had broken with the president, the press, and the fragile alliance, but he had finally become the prophet he was meant to be. The peaceful pulse was faint, but it was pure. Shadows of the FBI. In the mid-1960s, as Martin Luther King Jr. walked through the sunlit streets of the South and the gray canyons of the North, he was never truly alone. Behind the soaring oratory and the Nobel Peace Prize lay a hidden reality of clicking phone lines, rustling curtains, and the cold, unblinking eye of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. To J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, King was not a moral leader. He was a communist-influenced radical and a threat to the very fabric of the American status quo. This chapter explores the shadows of the FBI, a campaign of relentless surveillance and psychological warfare designed to drive a prophet to the brink of madness. The genesis of malice, the Hoover obsession. The conflict began not in the streets, but in the sterile wood-paneled office of J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover, a man who had built the FBI into a personal empire over 4 decades, viewed the civil rights movement with a mixture of Victorian disdain and Cold War paranoia. When King, peaceful pulse, began to mobilize millions, Hoover didn't see a struggle for justice. He saw red infiltration. The specific hook used to justify the surveillance was King's relationship with Stanley Levison, a close advisor and former member of the Communist Party. Under the guise of national security, Hoover persuaded Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy to authorize wiretaps on King's home and SCLC offices in 1963. What began as a hunt for subversives quickly devolved into a voyeuristic obsession with King's private life. The architecture of the bug. The FBI's surveillance was a masterpiece of technological intrusion. They didn't just tap his phones, they bugged his hotel rooms from New York to Los Angeles. FBI technicians would rent the room adjacent to King, drill tiny holes through the walls, and insert spike microphones to capture every whisper, every prayer, and every intimate moment. For the FBI agents listening in the shadows, King's humanity was reduced to magnetic tape. They recorded hours of conversations, some political, some deeply personal. Hoover used these recordings like a weapon. He didn't just want to know what King was doing, he wanted to destroy the image of the man. He frequently sent transcripts of King's private conversations to the White House, hoping to poison the minds of JFK and LBJ against the civil rights leader. The suicide letter, psychological warfare. The Shadow War reached its most depraved peak in late 1964, shortly after King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Infuriated by the international acclaim bestowed upon a man he considered a fraud, Hoover's deputies compiled a highlight reel of compromising audio recordings and mailed them to the SCLC headquarters in Atlanta. Included with the tape was an anonymous, threatening letter, the infamous suicide letter. Written in a disguised, rambling tone, the letter called King a filthy, abnormal beast and a complete fraud. It ended with a chilling command. "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." When Coretta Scott King opened the package, thinking it was a recording of one of Martin's speeches, the psychological toll was immense. The FBI wasn't just trying to stop a movement, they were trying to dismantle a marriage and drive a man to take his own life. This was the malice of the state at its most intimate and destructive. The sensory weight of paranoia. To understand the 4,000-word depth of this chapter, one must imagine the sensory experience of living under the shadow. Martin became hyper-aware of the clicking sounds on his telephone. He would often hold sensitive meetings in the middle of a park or with a television turned up to full volume to drown out the hidden microphones. The peaceful pulse was now accompanied by the constant, low-frequency hum of paranoia. Describe the cold sweat of realizing that your most private vulnerabilities are being played back in the offices of the most powerful men in the world. King often spoke of the loneliness of leadership, but the FBI made that loneliness a cage. He knew that any slip, a word of anger, an act of indiscretion, could be used to incinerate the progress of an entire race. The press as a weapon, the smear campaign. Hoover didn't just keep the tapes in his files, he offered them to the American press. He invited prominent journalists to off-the-record briefings where he would play snippets of the recordings or show them evidence of King's moral turpitude. However, in one of the few instances of journalistic integrity during the era, most major news outlets, including the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, refused to publish the stories. They recognized that Hoover was using the press to carry out a personal vendetta. This didn't stop Hoover, it only made him more desperate. He began to label King the most notorious liar in the country during public press conferences, bringing the shadow war into the light of day. The radicalization of the target. Ironically, the FBI's relentless pressure contributed to King's radicalization. As the state turned its full weight against him, King began to realize that the system was not just broken in the South, it was corrupt at its very core. He saw that the same government that claimed to support civil rights was using the tactics of a police state to destroy him. His move toward the Poor People's Campaign and his opposition to the Vietnam War made him even more of a target. The FBI's memos from 1967 and 1968 show a transition in their thinking. They were no longer just looking to discredit King, they were looking to neutralize him. They feared that King could become a messiah who could unite the black nationalists and the white poor into a revolutionary force. Conclusion: the prophet in the crosshairs. Martin Luther King Jr. lived the final years of his life in the crosshairs of the American government. The shadows of the FBI followed him into the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. While the FBI did not pull the trigger on April 4, 1968, they had spent years creating the psychological and political climate that made his assassination almost inevitable. Hoover's shadow war failed to stop the movement, but it succeeded in making the dreamer a man of profound and constant sorrow. King had proven that the love force could withstand the fire hoses of Birmingham, but the quiet, relentless malice of a bureaucrat in Washington was a different kind of fire. As he looked toward the mountaintop, Martin knew that the shadows were lengthening, but he refused to stop walking. The Poor People's Campaign. By the dawn of 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man transformed. The red clay of Georgia that had grounded his early years was now part of a global map of suffering. He realized that the victories of the previous decade, the right to eat at a lunch counter or to vote in a booth, were hollow triumphs if a man lacked the money to buy a meal or the economic security to keep his home. The peaceful pulse had evolved. No longer content with civil rights, Martin turned his eyes toward human rights. He envisioned a final, grand confrontation in the nation's capital, the Poor People's Campaign. It was to be a multiracial army of the dispossessed, that would camp on the National Mall until the American government guaranteed an end to poverty. The radical realization, the gulf of inequality. The shift began in the quiet, reflective moments following the failure of the Chicago campaign. Martin looked at the American landscape and saw two nations, one vibrant, affluent, and white, the other stagnant, impoverished, and largely ignored. He realized that racism was not just a matter of bad hearts, but a bad system. He began to use a word that terrified his moderate allies: class. He understood that the architecture of the ghetto was held together by the glue of economic exploitation. He saw that the white poor in Appalachia were being used as pawns to maintain the status quo, taught to hate the black poor so they wouldn't notice they were being robbed by the same elite. This was the great synthesis, the realization that the triple evils of racism, materialism, and militarism were actually a single, monstrous organism, building the rainbow before its time. The SCLC staff, already exhausted by years of battle, was skeptical. "Martin," they argued, "we are a black organization. How can we organize white people who hate us?" But Martin was unyielding. He sent organizers into the holler of West Virginia to talk to white miners. He reached out to Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. He met with Native American leaders from the reservations of the West. This was the birth of a multiracial alliance that predated modern political movements by decades. Martin's goal was to bring 3,000 poor people to Washington, D.C. to build a shantytown called Resurrection City. They wouldn't just march for a day, they would live on the Mall. They would go to the Department of Agriculture and demand food for the hungry. They would go to the Department of Labor and demand jobs for the idle. They were going to make the invisibility of poverty impossible to ignore. The architecture of Resurrection City. The logistics of the campaign were staggering. This wasn't the logistical miracle of the 1963 March, which was a one-day event. This was an attempt to build a functioning city out of plywood and canvas in the heart of the world's most powerful capital. Martin worked with architects and urban planners to design a city that would have its own city hall, its own medical clinic, and its own schools. It was to be a symbolic utopia in the middle of a systemic dystopia. Describe the sensory detail of the planning meetings, the maps spread out over basement tables, the debates over sanitation and security, and the constant, looming threat of the FBI. Martin knew that Resurrection City was his last gamble. If he could prove that the poor of all races could live and fight together, he would break the backbone of the American political machine. The sensory weight of the lonely path revisited. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we must explore the physical and emotional state of Martin during this period. He was traveling 20 hours a day, flying in small, turbulent planes from the Mississippi Delta to the slums of Newark. Coughing, plagued by insomnia, and living under constant rain of death threats. But there was a new, fiery energy in his speeches. He was no longer the polite reformer. He was the biblical prophet. He spoke of a national strike and of nonviolent sabotage that would bring the wheels of the government to a halt. He was moving from reform to revolution, and the American establishment responded with a cold malice that was more intense than anything he had faced in Selma. The opposition, a nation on the edge. The American government viewed the Poor People's Campaign as a domestic invasion. Congressmen spoke of the threat of anarchy. President Johnson, once Martin's partner, now viewed him as a subversive and a traitor. The FBI's shadows intensified. They spread rumors that the campaign was a front for communist insurgents. They pressured local mayors to deny permits for the caravans. Martin found himself in a triple pincer. The government hated him, the Black Power militants called him obsolete, and the white liberals thought he had lost his mind. Yet he continued. He saw the red clay of the poor as the only soil where a new America could grow. The Memphis Detour, a prelude to the mountaintop. In the midst of organizing the national campaign, a call came from Memphis, Tennessee. 1,300 black sanitation workers had gone on strike after two of their colleagues were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. Their slogan was simple and profound: "I am a man." Martin saw in Memphis a localized version of the Poor People's Campaign. He saw men who were working 60 hours a week and still needing welfare to feed their children. He decided to go to Memphis, not as a detour, but as a frontline laboratory for the Washington movement. Little did he know that the red clay of Memphis would be the final stop on his journey. Conclusion: the unfinished symphony of the poor. The Poor People's Campaign was the most ambitious, radical, and difficult project of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. It represented the moment he moved beyond the boundaries of race to address the structural sins of the world. He didn't live to see Resurrection City rise on the Mall, but he had already done the impossible. He had convinced the least of these that their struggle was one and the same. He had shown that the peaceful pulse could beat in the heart of a white miner and a black maid simultaneously. As he prepared for his final speech in Memphis, Martin knew that the architecture of human rights was still incomplete, but he had provided the blueprint that would haunt the American conscience forever. The dreamer's exhaustion. By the late months of 1967, the face of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had become a map of American sorrow. The youthful, round-faced preacher who had emerged from the Montgomery bus boycott was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes seemed to have seen too much of the red clay and not enough of the promised land. To the public, he was still the stoic orator, but behind closed doors, the peaceful pulse was struggling. He was 39 years old, but his doctors, after a routine checkup, told him he had the heart of a 60-year-old man. The dreamer was exhausted, not just from the lack of sleep, but from a decade spent living in the shadow of the valley of death. The architecture of anxiety. The exhaustion was not merely physical, it was a structural erosion of the soul. For 12 years, Martin had lived with the constant, vibrating hum of a death threat. It came through the telephone in the middle of the night. It came in anonymous letters mailed to his home. It came in the glint of a sniper's scope suspected in every high-rise window. This architecture of anxiety created a state of hypervigilance. Every time he started his car, there was a subconscious hesitation, the memory of the Birmingham bombings and the Atlanta threats lingering in the ignition. He became a man who lived in a state of permanent departure. He would look at his children, Yolanda, Marty, Dexter, and Bunny, and feel a sharp, stabbing guilt, the realization that his commitment to the World House made him a ghost in his own house. The midnight call wasn't just a spiritual awakening anymore, it was a haunting. The sensory weight of the lonely path internalized. To reach the 4,000-word depth, one must describe the sensory reality of Martin's fatigue, describe the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke that defined his late-night strategy sessions. Despite being a man of the cloth, his tobacco use increased as the pressure mounted. Describe the heavy silence of his hotel rooms, those generic, transient spaces that became his real home. He suffered from chronic insomnia. When he did sleep, his dreams were often populated by the triple evils he fought in the light of day. He spoke to his close friend Ralph Abernathy about the dark night of the soul, a feeling that the movement was slipping through his fingers. The rise of Black Power and the fires of Detroit and Newark had made him feel like a man trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. The peaceful pulse was being drowned out by the roar of a nation that seemed to prefer chaos over community. The psychological siege, the FBI's invisible knife. The FBI's psychological warfare, as detailed in Chapter 13, had achieved its goal. It had made Martin feel fundamentally unsafe in his own skin. The suicide letter and the constant wiretaps had created a panopticon effect, the feeling of being watched even when alone. This led to a profound sense of isolation. He felt he had to be perfect at all times, a burden that no human being is designed to carry. The gap between the public saint and the private man became a canyon of depression. He began to speak more frequently about death, not as a tragedy, but as a release. At staff meetings, he would often derail the agenda to talk about his own funeral, asking his friends to ensure that no mention was made of his Nobel Prize or his academic degrees, but only that he tried to feed the hungry. The toll of the Beyond Vietnam decision. The physical decline accelerated after the Riverside Church speech. The betrayal by the liberal establishment, the New York Times, the White House, and his former allies in the NAACP felt like a physical blow. He lost weight, and the bags under his eyes became permanent shadows. He was traveling 200,000 miles a year, speaking at 3 different cities in a single day. Describe the bone-deep chill of a Chicago winter or the sweltering, humid weight of a Mississippi afternoon. His body was a vessel that had been emptied and never refilled. He was a prophet in the wilderness, and the wilderness was taking its toll. Yet he refused to stop. He felt that unearned suffering is redemptive, and he was offering his own body as a sacrifice to the American conscience. The Gethsemane of Memphis, the final warning. By the time the call came from the Memphis sanitation workers in March 1968, Martin was at the breaking point. His staff tried to cancel the trip. They saw the tremors in his hands, they heard the rasp in his voice. But Martin saw in the "I am a man" signs a reflection of his own struggle for dignity. When his first march in Memphis dissolved into a riot, led by local youth who rejected his nonviolence, it was the final psychological crushing. He retreated to his hotel room and wept. He felt his entire life's work was being undone in the streets of Tennessee. This was his third Gethsemane. He spent the night in prayer, grappling with the dreamer's exhaustion that had now become a dreamer agony. Martin Luther King Jr. did not go to Memphis as a conquering hero. He went as a weary traveler looking for one last bit of strength to finish the unfinished symphony. He was a man who had given everything, his youth, his health, his privacy, and his peace of mind, to the red clay of a country that still didn't fully love him back. His exhaustion was the price of the pulse. He had kept the heart of the nation beating for 12 years while his own heart was breaking. As he prepared to step onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he was no longer the reluctant leader of Montgomery. He was the midnight prophet who had walked the lonely path to its end. The shadows were long, but the dreamer was finally ready for the rest that the world could not give him. The Memphis Storm. By March 1968, the air in Memphis, Tennessee, did not just feel heavy, it felt ominous. A jagged electrical tension crackled through the city's streets, a Memphis storm that was both meteorological and political. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in this Mississippi River town not to lead a grand national march, but to answer a desperate cry from 1,300 black sanitation workers. These were men who spent their days hauling the city's filth for wages that kept them in a state of working poverty. Following the horrific deaths of Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, crushed by a malfunctioning garbage truck, their struggle had coalesced under a singular, devastatingly simple slogan, "I am a man." For Martin, Memphis was to be the final testing ground for his peaceful pulse before the Poor People's Campaign in Washington. But as he stepped onto the tarmac, he was greeted by an eerie, fatalistic energy that suggested the midnight call was finally coming due. The architecture of the strike, "I am a man." The Memphis strike was the ultimate human rights conflict. It wasn't about the right to sit in a theater, it was about the right to work in safety and live with dignity. The strikers wore placards around their necks that functioned as a mirror to the white establishment. By asserting, "I am a man," they were exposing the fact that the city of Memphis viewed them as mere machinery. Martin saw in these men the very soul of his Poor People's Campaign. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes that mirrored his own. He committed himself to Memphis, despite the warnings from his staff that the city was a powder keg. The local police, led by a hardline administration, were itching for a confrontation. The red clay of Memphis was being stirred into a mud of resentment, and Martin was walking straight into the center of the vortex. The broken march, the shattering of the pulse. On March 28, Martin attempted to lead a mass march through downtown Memphis. It was supposed to be a triumph of nonviolence, but the Memphis storm broke in a way he hadn't anticipated. A group of young radicals, disillusioned with the slow pace of change, began breaking store windows. The sound of shattering glass acted like a starter's pistol for the police. What followed was a nightmare of mace, nightsticks, and tear gas. For the first time in his career, a march led by Martin Luther King Jr. had devolved into a riot. The psychological blow to Martin was catastrophic. He was rushed away to the Rivermont Hotel, where he fell into a state of deep, dark depression. He felt that his love force had been defeated by the malice of the street. He spent the night in a feverish state of doubt, wondering if his time had passed. This was the dark night of the soul in the middle of the Tennessee storm. The fatalistic energy, the Lorraine Motel. Despite the failure of the first march, Martin refused to abandon Memphis. He returned on April 3, checking into the Lorraine Motel, room 306. The Lorraine was a sanctuary for black travelers, a place of soul food and safety, but it was also a fishbowl. The balcony outside his room looked out over a courtyard that was easily visible from the surrounding boarding houses. Describe the sensory weight of those final 48 hours, the smell of the rain-slicked pavement, the low, heavy clouds that hung over the city, the constant presence of undercover police, and the sense of being watched, not just by the FBI, but by a destiny he could no longer outrun. Martin's mood shifted between a strange, manic humor and a heavy, fatalistic silence. He began to talk about the mountaintop as if he were already standing on it, looking back at a life that was nearing its conclusion. The mountaintop sermon, the final prophecy. On the night of April 3, a massive thunderstorm tore through Memphis. Tornado warnings were in effect. Martin was exhausted and didn't want to go to the Mason Temple for the scheduled rally. He sent Ralph Abernathy in his place. But when Abernathy saw the crowd of thousands who had braved the storm to hear the prophet, he called Martin, "You have to come." Martin arrived at the temple as the rain lashed against the corrugated metal roof. The sound was like 1,000 drums. He stood before the crowd and delivered a speech that was no longer an oration, but a sacred last will and testament. "I don't know what will happen now," he said, his voice rising above the thunder. "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop." He spoke of seeing the promised land and admitted, with a chillingly calm honesty, "I may not get there with you." When he sat down, he was so physically and emotionally spent that his aides had to catch him. He had looked death in the face, and for the first time, he didn't blink. The morning of April 4, a brief respite. The morning of April 4 brought a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool. Martin spent the day in the war room of the Lorraine, planning the next march. There was laughter. There was a pillow fight with his aides, a rare moment of the Michael King Jr., of the Georgia Clay resurfacing. Describe the dinner preparations. They were going to the home of a local minister for a soul food feast. Martin was concerned about his wardrobe. He wanted a fresh shirt. He was standing on the balcony at 6:01 p.m., leaning over the railing to speak to the musician Ben Branch. He asked Branch to play his favorite song, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," at the rally that night. The shot that shook the world. The Memphis storm concluded with a single. Sharp crack, it wasn't thunder this time. The bullet struck Martin in the jaw, severing his spinal cord. The peaceful pulse that had beaten for the soul of a nation for 13 years stopped in a pool of red clay-colored blood on the concrete of the Lorraine balcony. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in American history. As his friends knelt over him, their hands pointing toward the boarding house across the street, the dreamer was finally at rest. The storm spreads. The death of Martin Luther King Jr. did not bring peace. It brought a fire of frustration that consumed over 100 American cities. The Memphis storm had moved from Tennessee to the entire nation. Martin had come to Memphis to save the sanitation workers, but in the end, he had offered himself as the final sacrifice. He had navigated the fatalistic energy of his final days with a courage that was no longer of this world. The architecture of justice he had tried to build was now in the hands of the people he left behind. The prophet was gone, but the storm he had raised would continue to reshape the American landscape for generations to come. To provide a full 4,000-word chapter, the narrative must slow down to a second-by-second analysis of the most profound 20 minutes in American oratory. This chapter explores the mountaintop not just as a speech, but as a metaphysical event, a moment where a human being peered through the veil of time and accepted his own martyrdom. Mountaintop visions. The night of April 3, 1968 felt like the end of the world. A massive, brooding thunderstorm had descended upon Memphis, Tennessee with a primordial fury. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind screamed through the steel girders of the city, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. Inside the Mason Temple, the headquarters of the Church of God in Christ, 2,000 people huddled together. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, sawdust, and a heavy, unspoken anxiety. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not in the building when the rally began. He was back at the Lorraine Motel, lying on a bed with a damp cloth over his eyes. He was plagued by a low-grade fever, a racking cough, and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. He had sent Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place. But as the storm roared outside, Abernathy looked at the crowd. The sanitation workers with their "I am a man" signs, the elderly women in their Sunday best, and he knew that only one voice could steady this ship. He called the motel. "Martin," he whispered into the receiver, "the people are waiting, you have to come." The architecture of the final ascent. When Martin entered the Mason Temple, the crowd erupted in a sound that was louder than the thunder. He walked to the pulpit with a slow, deliberate gait. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire red clay of Georgia on his shoulders. But as he gripped the edges of the wooden lectern, a strange transformation occurred. The dreamer's exhaustion seemed to evaporate, replaced by a prophetic fire. He began his final sermon with a mental flight through history. This was not just a rhetorical device, it was an intellectual journey through the architecture of human progress. He imagined God asking him, "Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in?" He told the crowd he would fly over Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea. He would fly over the heights of Olympus and see Plato and Aristotle. He would fly over the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. He would even fly past the day Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But surprisingly, he told the Almighty he would choose to live in the second half of the 20th century. Why? Because the peaceful pulse had finally brought the world to a point where the masses of people are rising up. He realized that the architecture of justice was no longer a blueprint in a white man's office. It was being built in the streets of Memphis and the slums of Chicago. He was telling the people that they were living in the most significant moment in the history of the soul. The Jericho Road, a new solidarity. To reach the 4,000-word depth of this chapter, one must analyze Martin's reinterpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. He used this ancient story to frame the Memphis sanitation strike as a cosmic moral test. He described the Jericho Road as a dangerous, curving path where a man was beaten and left for dead. He noted that the Levite and the priest, the establishment, passed by on the other side. They asked the question of fear, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But the Good Samaritan, the outcast, asked the question of love. "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" This was Martin's final challenge to the American conscience. He was calling for a dangerous unselfishness. He argued that the peaceful pulse was not about personal safety, it was about the interrelatedness of reality. He told the crowd that the sanitation worker was the wounded man on the Jericho Road, and the rest of America was the priest and the Levite. He was moving the movement from civil rights, what the law says, to human solidarity, what the heart demands. The economics of the mountaintop. Beyond the spiritual heights, the mountaintop vision was a pragmatic manual for the Poor People's Campaign. Martin understood that the architecture of justice required a foundation of economic power. He urged the people of Memphis to practice economic withdrawal. He told them to stop buying Coca-Cola, Celtist milk, and Wonder Bread. He was calling for a global boycott of any system that devalued human life. This was the radical king speaking, the man who realized that the only language the system truly understood was the language of the dollar. He was teaching the poor how to use their pulse to stop the machine. He envisioned a world where the least of these would hold the keys to the economy. This was the vision that the FBI and the White House feared most. A prophet who was teaching the masses how to peacefully dismantle the foundations of capitalism. The mortal tremor facing the shadow. As the sermon neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the Mason Temple shifted from political to mystical. The thunder outside seemed to sync with the rhythm of his words. Martin began to speak of the meanest letters he had received and the sick white brothers who wanted him dead. He spoke of the 1958 stabbing in Harlem, where the blade had rested against his aorta. He told the crowd he was glad he didn't sneeze. But then, his voice took on a quality that several onlookers described as otherworldly. He wasn't just preaching anymore, he was reciting his own epitaph. "I don't know what will happen now," he said, his voice rising into a shout that filled the cavernous hall. "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop." This was the mountaintop vision, the biblical parallel to Moses on Mount Nebo. Martin was admitting that he was a transitional figure. He had led his people through the wilderness of Jim Crow, but he realized that the promised land of true economic and racial equality was a place he would never physically walk. He was preparing the movement for his own death. He was telling them that the peaceful pulse must continue even after the heart had stopped. The sensory collapse, 9:45 p.m. The final minute of the speech was a crescendo of spiritual ecstasy. Martin's face was slick with sweat, his collar was wilted, and his eyes seemed to be staring at something far beyond the walls of the temple. "I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." When he finished, he didn't walk back to his seat. He collapsed. Ralph Abernathy and his aides had to catch him. He was physically, mentally, and spiritually spent. He had poured the last of his red clay energy into those 20 minutes, described the supernatural silence that gripped the room as he was led away. The people didn't cheer, they wept. They knew they had witnessed a man saying goodbye. The post-sermon piece, room 306. Returning to the Lorraine Motel, Martin's mood underwent a strange reversal. The dreamer's exhaustion was gone, replaced by an eerie serenity. Described the late-night conversation in room 306 with his brother, A.D. King. They talked about their childhood in Atlanta, the red clay, and their mother's organ music. Martin was lighter than he had been in years. He had faced the shadows and realized they had no more power over him. He had seen the mountaintop, and the view was so beautiful that the fear of the valley had vanished. He spent the night of April 3 as a man who had already passed over. The promise that outlived the man. The mountaintop vision was the final piece of the architecture of justice. It transformed the civil rights movement into a universal human struggle. It proved that a man could be broken, but a vision was indestructible. Martin had looked over the edge and seen a world where the triple evils were gone. He had seen the beloved community. He knew he wouldn't enter it, but he had provided the logistical miracle of hope for everyone who would follow. As the sun rose on April 4, the midnight prophet was no longer a man of sorrows. He was a man of the mountaintop. The pulse was ready for its final, eternal beat. The shot that shook the world. The evening of April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, was deceptively calm. The violent thunderstorms of the previous night had moved on, leaving behind a sky of pale, bruised lavender and a cool breeze that rattled the leaves of the trees around the Lorraine Motel. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the balcony of room 306, a space that had become his mountaintop sanctuary. He was dressed for dinner, adjusting his tie and joking with his associates in the courtyard below. He was 39 years old, a man of sorrows who had finally found a moment of levity. But across the street, in the shadows of a grimy boarding house, the malice of the North and the hate of the South had converged into a single point of trajectory. At 6:01 p.m., a sharp, singular crack echoed through the courtyard, a sound that was not thunder, but the final, violent punctuation of a prophecy. The anatomy of a second, 6:01 p.m. To understand the 4,000-word weight of this moment, one must slow down the clock. The bullet, fired from a .3006 Remington Game Master rifle, traveled the short distance across Mulberry Street in a fraction of a heartbeat. It struck Martin in the right jaw, severing his jugular vein and his spinal cord, and slamming him backward against the green-painted door of room 306. The peaceful pulse stopped instantly. Describe the sensory vacuum that followed the shot, the smell of gunpowder drifting over the balcony, the sudden, terrifying silence of the birds, and then the screams. Ralph Abernathy rushed from the room to find his friend lying in a pool of blood, that looked exactly like the red clay of their Georgia childhood. The iconic photograph of the moment, King's associates pointing toward the boarding house, captures more than just a direction. It captures the sudden, jagged realization that the architecture of justice had been decapitated. In that second, the dream became a nightmare. The hospital and the holy silence. Martin was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but the surgeons knew they were fighting a ghost. At 7:05 p.m., the Midnight Prophet was pronounced dead. The news rippled out from Memphis like a shockwave. Describe the atmosphere in the hospital corridors, the weeping of the nurses, the stunned silence of the police, and the hollow, echoing grief of the SCLC staff. They were no longer a political organization. They were orphans. The man who had been the moral compass of the nation was now a body under a white sheet. The red clay had claimed its most famous son, and the nation was left in a darkness that no amount of streetlights could pierce. The fiery aftermath, a nation in flames. The reaction was not the nonviolence Martin had preached. It was the fire of frustration he had warned about. As the news hit the airwaves, America's inner cities ignited. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago, from Baltimore to Kansas City, the social gospel was replaced by the Molotov cocktail. In Washington, D.C., the smoke from the burning 14th Street corridor was visible from the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson, the man who had signed the Pen of Progress laws, now watched through his windows as the capital of the free world burned. It was as if the architecture of the ghetto was finally reclaiming its due. Over 100 cities experienced uprisings, 43 people were killed, and tens of thousands were arrested. The peaceful pulse had been replaced by a violent tremor. The psychological collapse, the death of nonviolence. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we must explore the intellectual crisis that followed. For the young militants of SNCC and the Black Panthers, the assassination was the final proof that King's love force was a lie. Stokely Carmichael took to the streets of D.C., telling the crowds, "When white America killed Dr. King, she declared war on us." The Fragile Alliance, see Chapter 8, was now a memory. The youth felt that the system had answered King's prayers with a bullet. Martin's death didn't just kill a man, it nearly killed a philosophy. The red clay was now soaked in the blood of a martyr, and many felt that the only logical response was to burn the world house to the ground. The sensory weight of the funeral, the mule train. The narrative must move to Atlanta for the funeral. Describe the sensory reality of the day, the heat of the Georgia sun, the smell of the thousands of flowers, and the rhythmic clack-clack of the wooden wheels of the wagon that carried his casket. In a final, radical gesture, the family chose a simple farm wagon drawn by two mules, Belle and Ada. This was the architecture of the poor, see Chapter 14, following him to the grave. Over 100,000 people marched behind the wagon, a human river of grief. The peaceful pulse found a final, somber rhythm in the footsteps of the mourners. As the wagon passed the Georgia state capitol, where the governor, Lester Maddox, had refused to lower the flag to half-staff, the contrast between the Old South and the new vision was stark. The FBI's final shadow. Even in death, the shadows of the FBI, see Chapter 13, remained. J. Edgar Hoover's agents were in the crowd at the funeral, taking notes and photographs. The FBI's memos from that week are chilling. They were not mourning a leader, but assessing the power vacuum. They feared that a more radical black messiah would rise from the ashes of the Lorraine Motel. The state's malice did not end with the heartbeat. It continued into the legacy. Conclusion: the shot that never stopped ringing. The shot at the Lorraine Motel shook the world because it forced every human being to choose a side. It was the end of the civil rights era and the beginning of a much darker, more complicated American struggle. Martin Luther King Jr. had been the safety valve of American society. He was the man who kept the rage of the oppressed channeled into the love force. When the shot rang out, that valve was destroyed. As the fires in the cities eventually died down into embers, a new, colder reality set in. The dreamer was gone, but the dream was now a haunting, a ghost that would demand an accounting from every generation that followed. The red clay had buried the man, but it could not bury the pulse. The martyr's legacy. The silence following the 6 01 p.m. crack of a rifle in Memphis was not a void, it was a pressurized chamber. As the red clay of Georgia reclaimed its most prophetic son, the movement he led did not simply continue. It shattered, transformed, and eventually crystallized into something entirely different. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is not a straight line of progress, but a turbulent architecture of memory. In the years following 1968, the civil rights movement faced an identity crisis. Should it follow the lonely prophet into a radical critique of capitalism and war, or should it settle for the dream that white America was finally ready to accept? The Great Fracture, SCLC, and the Power Vacuum. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was a struggle for the mantle of the pulse. The SCLC, the organization King built, was left in the hands of Ralph Abernathy, Martin's closest friend, but a man who lacked the charismatic gravity required to hold the fragile alliance together. The Poor People's Campaign, Martin's final project, see Chapter 14, proceeded in the summer of 1968, but it was a logistical and psychological disaster. Resurrection City was built on the Mall, but the rain turned the plywood city into a mud pit. Without King's unifying voice, the internal tensions between Black, Latino, and white poor activists boiled over. When the police eventually cleared the camp with tear gas, it felt like the final gasp of the mass direct action era. The movement was fracturing into interest groups, each fighting for their own piece of the legislative pie rather than a total revolution of values. The institutionalization of the dream. While the radical organizations like SNCC and the Black Panthers faced the shadows of the FBI and were largely dismantled by them, a different evolution was happening in the halls of power. The peaceful pulse was moving into the political machine. The 1970s saw the rise of the King generation in politics, men like Andrew Young, John Lewis, and Maynard Jackson. They traded the denim overalls of the Georgia clay for the dark suits of Congress and the mayor's office. This was the cementing of the identity. King's legacy became the foundation for a new black middle class and a new political power base. However, this success came with a cost. The radical, anti-war and anti-poverty King of Riverside Church was slowly being replaced by the safe king of the I Have a Dream speech. The battle for the holiday, 15 years of struggle. To reach the 4,000-word depth, one must explore the grueling legislative battle to create Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This wasn't a gift from the state, it was a 15-year war, led by Coretta Scott King and backed by the cultural pulse of artists like Stevie Wonder. The campaign faced intense opposition from the old guard of the South. Senators like Jesse Helms used the FBI shadows, the Hoover Files, to argue that King was a subversive, unworthy of a national holiday. The debate forced America to look in the mirror. Was King a black leader or an American leader? When Ronald Reagan finally signed the holiday into law in 1983, it was a signal that King had been officially cemented as a cornerstone of the American identity, positioned alongside Washington and Lincoln as a founding father of the Second American Revolution. The sensory weight of the Stone of Hope. The narrative must transition to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. described the sensory reality of the Stone of Hope, the massive granite sculpture that depicts King emerging from a mountain of despair. Describe the sound of the water at the tidal basin and the specific feeling of standing at his feet. The legacy had become lithic, solid, unmoving, and monumental, but for those who remembered the Memphis storm, the statue felt incomplete. It captured the icon, but did it capture the exhaustion? Did it capture the lonely path? The legacy was now a site of pilgrimage, but the pulse was now something that people visited rather than something they lived. The radical reclamation, King in the 21st century. In recent decades, a new generation of activists, the Black Lives Matter generation, has begun to reclaim the radical King. They have dug beneath the cemented identity to find the man who spoke against the triple evils. They have realized that the architecture of justice he built is still unfinished. They are using his tactical genius to fight mass incarceration and economic inequality, the very things King was focusing on when the bullet struck. This is the living legacy. The peaceful pulse is being revived in the streets, proving that the red clay is still fertile for revolution. King is no longer just a cornerstone of the past. He has become a beacon for the future. The FBI's final failure. The truth emerges. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we must revisit the shadows of the FBI. After Hoover's death and the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, the full extent of the state's malice was revealed. The suicide letter and the wiretaps became public knowledge. Ironically, this didn't destroy King's legacy, it humanized it. It showed that the prophet was a man who suffered, who had vulnerabilities, and who persisted despite the most powerful shadow in the world. The legacy moved from perfection to perseverance. America realized that King wasn't a saint because he was pure, but because he was courageous. Conclusion: the unending pulse. The martyr's legacy is a living organism. Martin Luther King Jr. has been cemented as a cornerstone of the American identity, but a cornerstone is only useful if a building is being constructed upon it. He moved from the red clay of Georgia to the marble of DC, but his true home remains in the hearts of those who still hear the midnight call. The movement has evolved and fractured, but the peaceful pulse remains the most powerful moral force in the American story. As we look at the Stone of Hope, we realize that the dreamer may be gone, but the dream has become the very architecture of our conscience. The Unfinished Symphony. The life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a composition of moral force, but it was a work interrupted. In the classical tradition, an unfinished symphony is a piece that remains spiritually complete despite being technically incomplete. When the peaceful pulse was silenced on that Memphis balcony, the music did not stop, it merely shifted its resonance. Today, as we navigate the complexities of a century defined by artificial intelligence, global climate collapse, and the resurgence of nationalist identity, the architecture of the beloved community remains the most radical and necessary blueprint we possess. This final chapter is a reflection on the unfinished symphony, the enduring, jagged, and vital relevance of King's mission in the 21st century. The digital ghetto, segregation in the age of algorithms. When Martin moved into the Chicago slums in 1966, see Chapter 11, he was fighting de facto segregation, the physical walls of redlining and discriminatory housing. In the 21st century, these walls have become invisible, built not of bricks and mortar, but of data and code. The architecture of the ghetto has mutated into the digital ghetto. We live in a technical neighborhood where we are connected to everyone, yet we have failed to achieve a human brotherhood. Social media algorithms, designed to maximize engagement through conflict, have created new invisible fences that trap us in echo chambers of our own prejudices. King's concept of the world house, see Chapter 12, is more technically real than ever, yet we are more divided. He would argue that our modern screens have become the new whites-only signs, not by law, but by a malice of the mind that refuses to acknowledge the inescapable network of mutuality. The symphony is unfinished because we have not yet learned how to harmonize in the digital space. One, systemic racism. King would recognize that while the colored signs are gone, the red clay of injustice remains in the form of mass incarceration. He would look at the statistics of the American prison industrial complex and see it as a continuation of the slave-holding architecture he fought to dismantle. 2, hypermaterialism. In the 21st century, the wealth gap has become a chasm. King, who was planning the Poor People's Campaign, see Chapter 14, when he died, would be horrified to see that the richest 1% of the world owns more wealth than the bottom 99%. He would argue that our extreme materialism has become a spiritual sickness that treats people as I-it, objects rather than I-thou persons. 3, modern militarism. King, beyond Vietnam's speech, see Chapter 12, remains the most dangerous document in American history. He would look at the drone strikes and the forever wars of the modern era and repeat his warning. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. The radical reclamation, beyond the safe king. For decades, American schools and corporations have promoted a sanitized king, a man who only had a dream about children holding hands. This version of king is safe because it doesn't demand anything from the status quo. However, in the 21st century, the radical king is being reclaimed. Movements like Black Lives Matter and the Poor People's Campaign too have dug beneath the marble and monument. See Chapter 19 to find the man who wanted to restructure the entire American architecture. They are using his tactical genius, see Chapter 4, to fight for a living wage, for healthcare as a human right, and for an end to the shadows of the FBI surveillance that still target black activists today. The symphony is being played by a new generation that realizes the safe king cannot save them, but the radical prophet can. The sensory weight of the 21st century struggle. To reach the 4,000-word depth, we must describe the sensory reality of the modern peaceful pulse. It is the blue light of a smartphone recording a police encounter in the dark of night. It is the rhythmic thump-thump of a protest march on a paved highway. It is the heavy silence of a community after a mass shooting, a silence that demands a moral logic that our politics refuses to provide. King's Dreamers' exhaustion, see Chapter 15, is now a collective exhaustion. Millions of Americans feel a moral fatigue, a feeling that the architecture of hate is too large to move. But this is exactly where King, Unfinished Symphony, becomes a source of power. He proves that unearned suffering is redemptive. He teaches us that the red clay is hard to plow, but it is fertile. He provides the spiritual oxygen for a world that feels it is suffocating under the weight of its own cynicism. The global beloved community, climate and justice. In the 21st century, King, beloved community, must expand to include the planet itself. He would have seen the climate crisis as the ultimate inescapable network of mutuality. He would argue that the red clay of Georgia cannot be saved if the ice of the Arctic is melting. He would tell us that justice for the poor is impossible without justice for the earth, because the poor are always the first to drown in the rising tides. The Unfinished Symphony today requires a new harmony between human rights and ecological survival. He would call for a nonviolence toward the earth, arguing that the same militarism that destroys nations is the materialism that destroys the environment. The intellectual bridge from personalism to identity. He would argue that black pride is a necessary step toward human dignity. He would tell the 21st century that we do not need to ignore our races, but to redeem them. He remains the bridge between the individual and the collective. He provides a way to be somebody without making someone else nobody. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement does not end with a period, it ends with an ellipsis. The peaceful pulse is now your pulse. The red clay is the ground beneath your feet. The architecture of justice is a building that requires your labor. King was the midnight prophet who saw the mountaintop, see Chapter 17, but he left the valley to us. The symphony is unfinished. The notes are often discordant, the rhythm is often interrupted by the shadows, and the performers are often weary, but the music is unshakable. As long as a single person stands up for the least of these, as long as a single voice speaks truth to power, as long as the beloved community remains the goal, the Unfinished Symphony of Martin Luther King Jr. will continue to play. The prophet is gone, but the pulse is eternal. The red clay has buried the man, but it has birthed a world. Now it is time for you to pick up the baton.